July 1943. 2 million men stood locked in a death grip across a single stretch of land. Over 6,000 tanks roared forward, engines howling, grinding the earth beneath them into dust and blood. Bombers screamed overhead. Fire rained from the skies, and the soil itself seemed to vanish under the weight of artillery. This wasn't just another battle. This was Hitler's last desperate gamble to turn the tide in the east. But the Soviets were ready. They had seen it coming. And what followed was not a German victory, but the slow, brutal destruction of the Nazi war machine. This was Kursk. And once it began, there was no escape. Chapter 1. Hitler's Last Gamble. It was the summer of 1943, and the fields of Western Russia were about to become a graveyard for steel, flesh, and ambition. But before that, before the earth was torn apart by 6,000 tanks, before bombers blackened the skies and soldiers melted into the mud, there was a decision. A single choice, made far from the front lines, behind closed doors, in a bunker deep beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. That decision would shape the fate of the Eastern Front, and ultimately, the fate of Nazi Germany. But to understand why Adolf Hitler took that gamble, we need to go back to a different kind of battlefield, a frozen one, to the ruins of Stalingrad just months earlier. In February of 1943, Germany suffered the most crushing defeat it had ever endured. Over 300,000 of its soldiers had been surrounded, cut off, and annihilated by the Red Army. Hitler had refused to let them retreat. He had ordered them to fight to the last man. And they did, starving, freezing, dying, in the name of the Führer. The Sixth Army had vanished, and with it, the illusion that the German war machine was unstoppable. But Hitler couldn't accept that. Not fully. To him, Stalingrad wasn't a turning point. It was a setback. A humiliation, yes, but one that could be corrected with one bold, decisive blow. He believed that if Germany could strike again, hard, fast, and with overwhelming force, it could shatter Soviet momentum, restore German dominance, and perhaps even knock the Red Army out of the war altogether. So he looked to the map, and his eyes locked on a place called Kursk. Kursk was more than just a name. It was the center of a massive, bulging front line, a salient, as military planners called it. Imagine a balloon sticking out of a wall, vulnerable at the sides, exposed at the front. That was the Kursk salient, about 160 miles wide and nearly 90 miles deep into German-held territory. To Hitler and his generals, it looked like the perfect place to strike. A chance to pinch off the bulge, surround the Soviet forces inside, and destroy them. But there were disagreements, serious ones. Some generals urged immediate action. Others, like Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's most respected tank commanders, warned against it. "Why do we want to attack in the east at all this year?" he asked. "Do you think anyone even knows where Kursk is?" Guderian had reason to be skeptical. Germany's panzer divisions were badly depleted after Stalingrad. Many of the tanks were worn down. Crews were exhausted. Supplies were low. And yet, Hitler insisted. He believed that Germany's new weapons, especially the Panther and Tiger tanks, would give them the edge. He said it clearly, "I want the attack carried out. The sooner, the better." But then, he hesitated. The offensive, codenamed Operation Citadel, was supposed to begin in spring. But Hitler kept delaying it. He wanted more time to gather strength, more time to deploy the new tanks, more time to prepare. Weeks passed, then months. And as Germany waited, so did the Soviets. But they weren't idle. Far from it. The Red Army, under the guidance of Marshal Zhukov and General Vasilevsky, was watching closely. They knew the salient was vulnerable, and they knew the Germans would come. Soviet intelligence, through spies, radio intercepts, and reconnaissance, had uncovered much of the German plan. They didn't know the exact date, but they knew the direction. They knew the size, and they had time to prepare. And so, behind the lines, the Soviets began digging. They built defenses unlike anything seen before. Layer after layer of trenches, hundreds of miles of barbed wire, thousands of anti-tank mines, bunkers, gun emplacements, communication lines. It was a fortress, not just above ground, but beneath it. Soldiers spent weeks under open skies, turning fields into death traps. And behind them, new units were trained. New tanks were assembled, ammunition stockpiled, and most importantly, they waited. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler grew increasingly obsessed. He believed the new German tanks, especially the heavy Tiger and the sleek Panther, would crush anything the Soviets threw at them. These weren't just machines to him. They were symbols, proof that German engineering could still dominate the battlefield. But the reality was more complex. The Tiger was powerful, yes. Its gun could destroy a Soviet T-34 at over a mile. Its armor was nearly impenetrable from the front. But it was also slow, heavy, prone to breakdowns. The Panther, faster and more advanced, was rushed into production. And many of the early models, untested and rushed, broke down before even reaching the battlefield. Still, Hitler believed. On the surface, it looked like Germany was preparing for a masterstroke. But underneath, there were cracks, tension among the high command, doubts about the operation. Even Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, noted in his diary that morale among officers was slipping. The shadow of Stalingrad still hung over them all. And then, in July, Hitler made the call. Operation Citadel would begin. It would be Germany's last great offensive on the Eastern Front. A strike aimed at the heart of Soviet defenses. A chance to reclaim momentum. To erase the memory of defeat. To prove that the Wehrmacht, bloodied but not broken, could still win. But by the time the tanks began to roll, the Red Army was already waiting. The battlefield had become a trap, vast, silent, and deadly. And soon, the roar of engines would be drowned out by the thunder of artillery. Hitler believed Kursk would be his redemption. But what he didn't know was that the Soviets had turned the salient into a steel graveyard. They weren't just going to resist. They were going to bleed the Wehrmacht dry. And in the coming days, history would be written, not in grand speeches or maps, but in mud, fire, and steel. The die was cast, and in the distance, the storm was coming. Chapter 2. The Kursk Salient, a trap or opportunity. The earth split open beneath them. Tanks, lined hull to hull, vanished into fire. A German Panther exploded in a sudden burst of metal, its turret hurled into the air like a discarded toy. The crew inside never stood a chance. Just meters ahead, a Soviet anti-tank mine waited silently under loose soil, its job done in less than a second. In that moment, it didn't matter how well-trained the men were, how advanced the machine was, or how detailed the plan had seemed on paper. In this place, the ground itself could kill. This was the Kursk salient, a stretch of land so ordinary on a map, just a bulge in the line. But on the battlefield, it was the stage for one of the most complex, deadly, and strategic confrontations in military history. How it came to exist, and why both sides obsessed over it, would shape the course of the entire Eastern Front. After the crushing defeat at Stalingrad, the German front lines had begun to bend. The Red Army, now stronger and more organized, had pushed west with fury. But they hadn't broken through everywhere. Not yet. In the center of the front, between the cities of Orel in the north and Belgorod in the south, a strange formation appeared, what the generals called a salient. To the untrained eye, it was just a curve on the front line. But to a military planner, it looked like opportunity or disaster. Imagine a finger sticking out from a clenched fist. That was the salient. The Soviets held that finger, stretched nearly 90 miles westward from the city of Kursk. Its base was about 160 miles wide. On either side, German forces surrounded it. If the Germans could attack from both the north and the south, and meet behind the tip of the bulge, they could encircle and trap hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops inside. It would be another giant pocket, like the ones in the early years of the war. A chance to destroy entire armies in a single blow. But the Soviets saw it too, and they had no intention of letting history repeat itself. To Stalin's generals, the salient was more than a risk. It was bait. Marshal Zhukov believed that if the Germans were so focused on trying to pinch off the bulge, they could be drawn into a fight on Soviet terms. Instead of attacking blindly or overextending, the Red Army could build layers of defenses inside the salient, walls within walls, and wait. Let the Germans come. Let them bleed. This clash of visions, one side seeing a chance for victory, the other planning a trap, turned Kursk into something more than terrain. It became a test of patience, pride, and power. A battlefield waiting for a spark. The geography of the region didn't help either side. Kursk itself sat on gently rolling hills and open fields. In the dry season, the land was firm enough for tanks and trucks to move, but in the rainy months, the soil turned to mud. Villages dotted the landscape, connected by dirt roads and narrow paths. Rivers and forests interrupted the plains, natural choke points that could be used for ambushes or defenses. For the Germans, mobility had always been their strength. They called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war, where speed, surprise, and concentrated firepower could break through enemy lines. But Kursk threatened that formula. It was too exposed, too obvious. Blitzkrieg worked best when the enemy was unprepared. Here, the Soviets were anything but. Still, Hitler believed in the plan. He saw the salient as an open wound, something to be closed quickly and violently. He approved Operation Citadel with the same cold logic that had guided his earlier offensives. Hit hard, hit fast, encircle, destroy, move on. But even within the German high command, doubts began to grow. General Model, who would lead the northern pincer, warned that the Soviet defenses were deeper than anyone expected. Reports showed thousands of mines, concrete bunkers, overlapping artillery zones. Guderian, who had helped invent Blitzkrieg, argued that Germany should focus on defense, not offense. "We're not ready," he said bluntly. "And even if we win, it will cost too much." But Hitler wouldn't hear it. He believed Germany's new tanks would break through any defense. The Panther, the Tiger, machines of terrifying firepower and armor. He imagined them charging through Soviet lines like unstoppable beasts. What he didn't realize was that the battlefield wasn't just lined with mines. It was built to swallow machines whole. The Soviets, meanwhile, transformed the salient into something no one had ever seen before. It was no longer just a bulge in the line, it was a fortress. Soldiers dug 7 defensive belts around it, each stretching for miles. There were trenches for infantry, pits for tanks, artillery hidden in tree lines, and entire fields sown with explosives. Engineers laid more than 1 million anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. The fields didn't look dangerous. They looked empty, but every step forward could be a death sentence. Inside those defenses, Soviet troops waited. Some were veterans of Stalingrad, scarred, silent, hardened by street fighting. Others were new recruits, barely 18, nervous, eager to prove themselves. They drilled in the heat, ate thin rations, wrote letters home. Some wrote poems. Others carved names into their rifles. They knew what was coming. And still, the waiting dragged on. By delaying Operation Citadel, Hitler hoped to gather more forces. But every day of delay gave the Soviets more time to prepare. It was a paradox. The stronger the Germans became, the stronger their enemy became too. Then there was the question of timing. Summer was ideal for movement, but only if the weather held. Too late, and the rains would return. Too early, and the tanks wouldn't be ready. By early July, it was clear the window was closing. But the men on the ground didn't see a calendar. They saw tension, whispers, long nights under stars, commanders inspecting trenches, trucks bringing in crates of ammunition, the smell of fuel in the air, the taste of dust. Soviet soldiers scrawled dates on the inside of their helmets. Some drew red stars. Others drew skulls. German troops massed in forests just outside the salient, hidden beneath camouflage nets. Crews cleaned gun barrels. Tank commanders gave quiet speeches. "You are the tip of the spear," they said. "You will bring victory." But among them, there were no illusions. They had heard stories of Soviet traps. Some had seen it themselves in previous campaigns. There was fear, but also determination. They were still soldiers of the Wehrmacht. They still believed in their training, their leaders, and their weapons. In Berlin, Hitler met once more with his generals. Maps were spread, lines drawn. Kursk was at the center of it all. It would be the battleground that proved German dominance, or exposed its limits. "We will strike," he said. and we will break them. No one in that room could predict what would come next, because what awaited them inside that bulge was not just resistance. It was a new kind of warfare, a defense designed not just to stop an army, but to destroy it from within. A salient, not as weakness, but as bait. And as German engines roared to life and the first tanks moved into position, the question still hung in the air. Was Kursk the key to German victory? Or was it the Soviet trap they had walked into willingly? The answer would come in fire, in steel, and in blood. And it was only days away. Chapter 3: Operation Citadel, Germany's Grand Plan. A German Tiger tank lay sideways in a smoking ditch, its turret blown open, its engine still smoldering. Inside, the air was thick with dust, blood, and silence. Nearby, a young panzer commander knelt in shock, his uniform scorched, his face blank. Moments ago, he had led a column of steel giants into what they thought was a breakthrough. Now, he was the only one left moving. Around him, broken machines hissed like dying animals. The plan had promised speed, precision, and glory. Instead, it had delivered fire, confusion, and loss. This was not what they had trained for. This was Operation Citadel, Hitler's grand design to crush the Soviet front and turn the war around in a single, decisive stroke. But how did it begin? What was the thinking behind it? And why did the world's most feared army, after years of triumph and tactical genius, walk straight into a trap? The seeds of Citadel were planted in February of 1943, just days after Germany's capitulation at Stalingrad. The Eastern Front was cracking, but not yet broken. Hitler still believed in one more bold attack. Not just any offensive, something massive. Something that would remind the Soviets and the world that Germany was still the master of war. He called for his top commanders, his architects of movement and destruction, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, General Walter Model, and General Heinz Guderian. Each of them brought something different to the table. Manstein, cold and brilliant, had already stunned the Soviets earlier that year with a daring counterattack that recaptured Kharkiv. He was Hitler's favorite strategist, calm under pressure, logical, and ruthless. He believed that with the right planning, even a weakened army could deliver fatal blows. Model, by contrast, was a hard-nosed pragmatist, gruff, defensive-minded, and stubborn. He had a reputation for holding the line, no matter the odds. And then there was Guderian, the father of Germany's armored warfare. Outspoken, sharp, and unafraid to argue with Hitler himself. Together, they began shaping a new idea. Operation Citadel. The plan was simple on paper. Strike both shoulders of the Kursk salient, north and south, at the same time. Meet in the middle. Trap the Soviet armies inside. Destroy them. A classic pincer movement, like the ones that had brought victory in Poland and France. But this time, it was meant to be bigger, deadlier, and final. The northern assault would be led by Model and the German Ninth Army, pushing down from Orel. In the south, Manstein's 4th Panzer Army and a detachment of elite SS Panzer divisions would drive up from Belgorod. If both arms of the attack could move fast enough, they'd cut off the entire bulge. The Soviets would be surrounded, again, and the front line would collapse. But for all its boldness, Citadel faced one major problem from the start: time. Hitler was convinced that new technology would guarantee success. He believed that Germany's new tanks, the heavy Tiger and the sleek Panther, would turn the tide. The Tiger was a monster of a machine, nearly 70 tons. Its armor could shrug off anything short of a direct hit from close range. Its gun could pierce a Soviet T-34 from over a mile away. To many German crews, it was invincible. But invincibility came at a cost. The Tiger was slow, clumsy. It broke down often, especially on uneven terrain. Its size made it an easy target from the air, and there weren't enough of them. That's where the Panther came in. Lighter, faster, and better suited for open combat. The Panther had a long-barreled 75mm gun and sloped armor, making it harder to penetrate. It was supposed to be the future of German armor. But in spring of 1943, it was still untested. Many models straight from the factory suffered from engine fires, transmission failures, and fuel leaks. In tests, They looked perfect. In the field, they told a different story. Still, Hitler waited. He delayed the operation again and again, wanting more Panthers, more Tigers, more preparation. Meanwhile, Guderian was growing more vocal in his opposition. He argued that the Eastern Front didn't need another offensive, it needed time to breathe, to rebuild, to dig in and hold what was left. He told Hitler, face to face, "You're putting the last of our strength into an attack that we don't need to make." But Hitler didn't back down. He couldn't. Citadel wasn't just a plan, it was a statement. A chance to erase the humiliation of Stalingrad. A final blow to crush Soviet morale and show the world that the Reich still had teeth. So the generals obeyed. They coordinated movements. They massed over 900,000 men, nearly 3,000 tanks, over 2,000 aircraft, artillery units, supply trains. Everything pointed at the salient. In the south, Manstein's army took in elite Waffen-SS divisions, Leibstandard, Das Reich, and Totenkopf. These were hardened, fanatical units, trained to push hard and take ground at all costs. In the north, Model's forces dug in for the toughest part of the operation, where Soviet defenses were strongest. But even as they prepared, the Germans knew the Soviets were watching. Recon flights over the salient showed movement, trenches, mines, bunkers. The intelligence was clear. This would not be a surprise attack. The element of shock, so vital to Blitzkrieg, was gone. Instead, Germany would be walking into a fight that the enemy had spent months preparing for. In a quiet room in Berlin, Manstein looked over the maps. He saw the lines, the objectives, the timetable. He was a man known for icy calm, but even he sensed it, the weight of expectation, the fragility of the plan. "It is dangerous," he told his staff, "but if we strike quickly, and if our tanks hold, it can work." Model, meanwhile, stared at the reports of minefields, so dense that they couldn't be cleared in time. He worried about the forests in the north, the rivers, the mud. He worried about the air. Would the Luftwaffe still control the skies? Could they hold off the Red Air Force long enough for the panzers to break through? And then there were the men in the tanks. Thousands of them. Young, confident. Some veterans. Some fresh from training. They didn't know the full details of Citadel, but they knew they were part of something big. Some wrote notes in journals. Others made small jokes, trying to keep the fear away. A few prayed, quietly, before sleep. On the Soviet side, Zhukov knew what was coming. He had studied German strategy for years. He recognized the pincer, the timing, the rhythm of German offensives. He advised Stalin to hold back the attack, to let the Germans come, to use the strength of their assault against them. "Let them break themselves," he said. "Then we strike." Citadel was not yet in motion, but already it was tightening around both sides like a noose. And then, after months of waiting, delays, and arguments, the order was given. Citadel would launch on July 5th. No more waiting. The engines fired to life. Tank crews loaded shells. Commanders gave final speeches. Somewhere on the front, a soldier looked up at the sky and whispered, "Let this be over quickly." But nothing about what was coming would be quick. Citadel wasn't just a battle plan. It was a gamble with everything Germany had left. And the clock had just started ticking. Chapter 4, Reading the Enemy, Soviet Intelligence Breakthroughs. The rain lashed down over the pines near Kursk. Cold, gray, and quiet. Too quiet for a front about to explode. But the silence was deceiving. In a hidden radio post miles from the front line, a Soviet intelligence officer listened to a frequency crackling with German voices. He didn't know it yet, but what he was about to decode would change the course of the war. The Germans were speaking in code, but not well enough. By the spring of 1943, the Red Army already knew the attack was coming. They didn't know when or precisely where, but the broad shape of it, the teeth of it, that had already been seen. Soviet spies embedded across Europe were feeding fragments of information into Moscow like threads of a vast, invisible net. Some of it came through coded radio signals, some arrived by hand, smuggled inside boots, newspapers, and even hollowed-out pencils. And in Stalin's war room, a silent war was being fought, a war of minds, whispers, and signals. The Soviet Union's advantage didn't come from just one place. It came from the overlap. German generals had a habit of underestimating Soviet capabilities, especially when it came to intelligence. They thought the Red Army was blind. In truth, it had grown eyes in the dark. The British had Bletchley Park, but the Soviets had the Rote Kapelle, the Red Orchestra, a shadowy web of informants stretching from Berlin to Brussels. These were not simply soldiers or saboteurs. They were radio operators, cryptographers, civil servants, even secretaries in high places. They passed along troop movements, conversations overheard in meetings, train schedules, and most importantly, timelines. By early May, Soviet intelligence intercepted references to something massive, an operation called Citadel. And that changed everything. But Stalin was still unsure. Even with the intelligence, he hesitated. After all, some of it was too precise. Could it be disinformation? A trap? And then came the radio intercepts, the gold mine. In June, Soviet Signal Corps began picking up encoded messages from German panzer divisions massing west of Kursk. The Germans were shifting units from France, Italy, and even North Africa. Entire divisions were being swallowed by the railroads and reappearing in Belarus and Ukraine. The buildup was undeniable. It was no longer a matter of if. It was when. But the true turning point came when Soviet codebreakers, men and women working in near silence in basements beneath Moscow, managed to piece together the rough dates of the assault. They didn't crack every code, but enough. Just enough. The messages pointed to early July. And this time, Stalin listened. Marshal Zhukov, the famed Soviet commander who had already crushed the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, advised against launching a premature offensive. Let them break their teeth, he said. Let them come. And so, the Red Army dug in. The intelligence gave them time, not weeks, but months. It was enough to construct an iron wall of defense across the Kursk salient. Mines, trenches, anti-tank ditches, artillery in layers. Nearly 1 million Soviet troops would be waiting, buried like steel in the earth. But none of it would have been possible without the spies, the decoders, and the men and women with headphones pressed to their ears, listening through the crackle of static for one phrase, one sentence, one moment that might save a division or doom it. Among them was a young officer named Elena Mikhailova. She was only 22. Her job was to translate captured German messages, day and night. She worked in shifts so long she forgot what daylight looked like. Once, she paused at a phrase, Panzergruppe auf Position 2. A panzer group is in position 2. She knew what that meant. And within hours, a Soviet division was moved out of the line of fire. That single intercept saved thousands of lives. But the Germans were not entirely blind either. They knew the Soviets had grown more cunning. So they fed false signals too. Ghost divisions that didn't exist. Tank movements that were never real. A game of shadows inside a war of fire. Still, the Soviet machine had one advantage the Germans didn't: paranoia. Where Hitler demanded loyalty above reason, Stalin demanded preparation above everything else. He didn't trust anyone, including his own generals. So he double-checked every piece of intel. And in doing so, he caught patterns the Germans missed. Even Soviet farmers noticed the signs. In villages outside Kursk, old men noticed troop movements on roads usually meant for grain carts. Entire factories were shifted east in silence. Ammunition stockpiles appeared overnight. Trenches zigzagged across fields of wheat. But for the average soldier, men like Private Yuri Sokolov, none of this made the picture clearer. He was 19, barely trained, and assigned to a machine gun nest near Prokhorovka. They say the Germans are coming, he wrote in his diary. But when? I don't see them. Only wire. Only holes. Only more waiting. Yuri didn't know that far to the west, in a smoky bunker lined with maps, German General Erich von Manstein was growing impatient. Operation Citadel had already been delayed twice. Each delay gave the Soviets more time to fortify, and each delay meant the element of surprise bled away. But Hitler believed the new tanks, especially the heavy Tiger and the sleek Panther, would punch through anything. His generals weren't so sure. And the more they delayed, the louder the doubts grew. Soviet intelligence picked up on this tension, too. One intercept, translated by Elena herself, revealed a disagreement between Hitler and his field commanders. Manstein wanted to strike in mid-May. Hitler pushed it to early July. That message became the final confirmation Zhukov needed. Dig in. Wait. Let the storm come. Still, Soviet commanders were not blind to the cost of passivity. What if the Germans outflanked them? What if the attack wasn't in Kursk at all? What if this was all a feint? The intelligence was good, but never perfect. Zhukov ordered reconnaissance flights, spy patrols, and civilian informants to scan the roads, bridges, and rail yards west of the salient. They watched as German engineers laid tracks for tank transport, watched as fuel depots grew fat with supply trains, watched as the airfields filled with aircraft. And then, the radios went quiet. For days in early July, the German frequencies went silent. No more coded messages. No more chatter. Nothing. That silence, for Soviet intelligence, was louder than any broadcast. It meant only one thing. They were coming. Yuri Sokolov awoke to the sound of engines, distant but growing. The air smelled like rain and oil. He clutched his rifle and whispered a prayer. He wasn't religious. Not really. But in that moment, even silence needed something to hold on to. Behind him, tanks rumbled into position. Spotlights flickered across barbed wire. And somewhere down the trench line, a whistle blew. It was still dark when the first German artillery shells fell. But the Soviets were ready. Because they had listened. They had read the signals. Decoded the whispers. Dug in where others would have run. And now, as the largest armored assault in history prepared to unfold, the men and women of Soviet intelligence, nameless, often forgotten, had already won the first battle. The one fought in shadows. But could they win the next? The one fought in fire. Chapter 5. Stalin listens to Zhukov. The ground shook with thunder before the dawn. A salvo of Soviet artillery erupted across Kursk's ring of defenses, ripping earth and metal apart. Gun crews shouted. Shells screamed. Trenches buckled. And in that chaos, one message rang clear through the smoke. Whether to stand or to strike first would decide the fate of millions. But inside Stalin's command bunker, another sound was louder, the weight of choice. The debate among Soviet leaders had become urgent. The frontline commanders, embattled after Stalingrad's terror and yet growing in confidence, urged immediate attack. Use the momentum. Push the Germans before they struck. Strike them in retreat. Reclaim lost ground. Yet other voices, cautious but firm, warned that premature action could play into Hitler's hands and shatter Soviet forces before the trap was fully set. Stalin sat behind his desk, silent but watchful. His eyes, cold and calculating, rested on Marshal Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov, the architect of the victory at Stalingrad, had seen the Germans come. He understood their rhythms, their reliance on surprise and shock. He believed they would strike Oscar's hour to slice the Kursk salient, and that the Soviets should not rush into their teeth. Strike too soon, and their forces would bleed prematurely. Wait. Hit on their terms. The advisors spoke in hushed urgency. One argued the Soviets had fresh troops west of the line. Attack now, while German morale was low. Another warned that delays would cost lives, that winter rains might mire tanks and bog down supply lines. Supply lines, the lifeblood of armies. Analogy of a wounded man bleeding out. Delay too long, and the wound becomes fatal. Zhukov's voice finally rose, firm but low. He spoke not of numbers, but of pattern, like a chess player feeling the opponent's next move. They believe in their panzers, panthers and tigers. They think shock will win the day. Let them come. Let them squander their momentum. Then we strike, on ground we've shaped. In that room, each man recognized the gamble. Stalin, usually silent in public, bit his lip. He weighed the cost, strike first, and maybe catch Germany off guard, or delay and risk giving them time to mass more weaponry. But he also knew this. The Soviets had intelligence. They had spies, decrypted messages, troop movements. They knew the Germans were on borrowed time. Waiting wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Across the desk, Georgy Zhukov's expression hardened. Behind him, Maps of Kursk and Belgorod glowed under the low lamp. He stared at the bulge, a finger of Soviet-held land gripped on all sides. At its tip lay German forces gathering. On the bold lines of that map, he pointed out layers of Soviet defenses, trenches, minefields, artillery belts. Every inch, he said, is prepared. Stalin looked again at his generals. Some nodded stiffly. Others exchanged glances. Finally, the dictator, usually consumed with certainty, spoke quietly. We wait. A murmur passed among the advisors. Some relief, some frustration. The decision was made. Hold. Refuse to be drawn. Let the attack come. And when it did, counter with overwhelming force. A young officer, Ivan Petrov, scribbled in his notebook, hold until they break. He thought of his brother at the front. He thought of the trenches so deep soldiers no longer saw sunlight. He thought of the millions waiting on this choice. Time stretched with every passing hour. The rain began to fall. Supply trains chugged west. Ammunition boxes stacked. Trenches deepened. Soldiers huddled in dugouts, writing letters home by candlelight. This wasn't waiting. It was preparation. A quiet storm gathering under the surface. Yet not all barriers were physical. Inside Soviet ranks, some officials whispered doubts. What if Stalin had misread? What if the Germans feinted record strength, sent mock divisions to draw attention west? What if this trap was illusion? Anxiety grew. Small doubts devoured pages in diaries. A political commissar wrote, "We hold on faith." That phrase passed among ranks, emboldening some, unsettling others. Days passed. Reconnaissance flights buzzed overhead, returning with photographs of German armor lines stretched for miles. Engineers worked to reinforce fields with more mines. Civilians were drafted to dig. Mothers brought food to soldiers. Children plaited flax into camouflage nets. The land itself became a weapon. Behind it all stood Zhukov, focused as ever. He reviewed every intercept, every map, every report. His face, drawn by stress, betrayed discipline, because he knew the danger of proactivity. A wrong move, and battlefield would turn red with blood. But the Germans had to show their hand first. Then came July. On the 12th, German forces inched into the belts. Artillery hammered forward lines. But Soviet guns answered with equal fury. The pincer was being tested, and Zhukov watched. Stalin's choice hinged now on one final moment. Had the Germans exposed their intent by hitting the outer belts with their best forces? Was their strength enough to break through, or were they already bleeding? The answer would decide when, and how, the Red Army would strike back. The men in Moscow sat in silence, awaiting the signal. Outside, the front trembled. Inside, decisions crystallized. No longer an abstract gamble, but a living, breathing contest, waiting to erupt. When the first shells struck Soviet trenches that morning, Zhukov watched from Moscow. A line from an aide. First contact is made. A simple phrase, but a universe of meaning. Stalin leaned forward. Zhukov's eyes didn't waver. They both knew. If the Germans falter, delay would pay dividends. If they break through, waiting could mean disaster. At that moment, the field went silent. Commands went unread. A general gasped. A clerk's pen dropped. All waited for the next signal, the next move, because nothing about Kursk was simple anymore. Months of debate. Millions of men. One decision. Stalin had chosen. And now, it was time for the storm to begin. The next choice would come from battlefield, where clarity was only found in fire, in movement, in blood. Chapter 6. The defenders dig in. Fortresses of earth and steel. A storm of steel and mud. Layers of buried wire snapping under boot heels. Empty fields turned into deadly traps overnight. Men vanished into the ground. This was the moment when Kursk ceased to be open land and became a fortress built by fear, sweat, and iron will. Soviet soldiers were not just bunkered. They were buried alive in preparation for a storm they knew was coming. The effort began long before first shells flew. Well before any German tank rolled forward, the Soviets marched miles of earth into walls. Hundreds of miles of trenches cut across fields, weaving like giant scars. Some trenches were simple uprooted furrows for infantry. deep enough that a man could stand in them and count the stars. Others were anti-tank ditches, moats wide and deep, designed to swallow machines whole, like a trapdoor under steel giants. Between those trenches lay fields of wire so dense it looked like metal vines strangling the land. Barbed wire, rows of it, twisted coils stretched across open ground in waves, each loop more deadly than the last. And beneath the surface, hidden like silent ghosts, millions of mines lay buried. Anti-tank mines disguised beneath loose soil, and anti-personnel mines scattered like deadly pebbles. Any step forward could end in fire. Men like Sergeant Clement Petrov, just 19 but hardened by war, stood knee-deep in muddy trenches, hammering stakes for barbed wire. His hands shook, not from cold, but from exhaustion. He thought of home, his mother's voice in the kitchen, the smell of fresh bread, and wondered how many mornings she would wake to a son who never returned. Engineers worked day and night. Cranes, trucks, horses, every tool available ferried concrete bunkers into place. These were not primitive shelters. Some bunkers were built from reinforced concrete, walls thick enough to stop cannon fire, angled ceilings to deflect artillery shells, narrow slits for machine guns to sweep the fields. They became steel nests embedded into the earth, invisible from afar but lethal up close. To outside observers, the terrain looked empty. And that was the point. The weapons of war were all hidden, under skin of earth. From a distance, the field looked calm. But up close, one wrong step and death waited patiently beneath. The Soviets also created belts of artillery and communication lines. Every few hundred yards, gun emplacements peeked from behind hills or trees. Large AA material and 122mm guns pointed towards the skies, ready to blast any German bombers. Trenches were linked by communication trenches, narrow tunnels so soldiers could move unseen across front lines, like hidden passageways behind walls. Supply routes snaked through the safe zone behind the main lines, camouflaged paths carved through trees, camouflaged trucks bringing food, ammo, water. Field kitchens warmed meals beneath camouflaged tarps. Nurses treated the wounded in makeshift dugout hospitals, where each bunk held 2 men, separated only by blankets. They'd pray quietly through the night. Each worker, engineer, sapper, cook, medic, rifleman, felt the pressure. They knew the Germans would come. They felt the weight of responsibility heavy at their backs. And in the face of exhaustion and fear, small acts of kindness grew courage. A mechanic sharing a scrap of bread with a stranger. A nurse smoothing a soldier's hair. Soldiers carving letters in their helmets. To Mother, for Lena. The weapons they prepared were technical, but their explanation lent simple metaphors. Trenches were veins, carrying men, orders, supplies constantly. Anti-tank ditches were trapdoors. Once open, nothing heavy could cross. Barbed wire was like thorns, painful and entangling. Mines were hidden landmines inside a field of flowers. It was brutal poetry. And as the belts of defense multiplied, Soviet commanders, Marshals Zhukov and Vasilevsky, walked among the works. They watched lines of defenses rise like layers of skin covering Kursk's flank. They spoke to officers, asking if wire loops were tight enough, if mines were spaced right, if trenches drained when it rained. They checked maps, counted units, insisted on redundancy. Every layer had to slow the Germans, slow enough that the stronger, deeper anti-tank belt could blunt the punch of German panzers. Commander Vladimir Korol, overseeing the southern sector, was haunted by what he'd seen at Stalingrad. He ordered extra belts. He insisted on overlapping fields of fire, machine guns angled to cover every section of trench from 2 directions, artillery zones that bracketed every gap. He told his subordinates, softly but firmly, "Our trenches will not only stop the bullet, they will stop fear." Within weeks, Kursk's perimeter had 7 defensive belts. Each belt stretched tens of miles. Some scholars later compared them to rings of a great tree, growth rings around the salient. Each ring was stronger than the last, each a test of German endurance. Soldiers practiced here too. Night drills, simulating tank attacks in the dark, crawling along trenches, launching grenades through slit windows. Anti-tank crews set up fake tanks, wooden dummies, and drilled crews to fire under simulated pressure. By the time the real assault came, many men said they had already rehearsed every inch of battlefield. Under the surface, mines numbered nearly 1 million, anti-tank and anti-personnel combined. It was a spider's web. Engineers had to mark safe paths behind lines with chalk and yarn, so Soviet supply teams wouldn't step on the wrong soil. Accidents happened. A recruit named Mikhail lost part of his leg when fellow soldiers forgot to replace the chalked path after rain washed it away. He survived, but changed. He spoke rarely, his voice quiet, his eyes haunted. Yet he refused hospital. "They'll need me," he said. The fear in those defenses was not of weapons. It was of silence. The stillness before shells fell. The quiet wire waiting for boots. The waiting that made men remember home. These were not walls of hate. They were walls of survival. And as time ticked by toward July, the fortress grew complete. Behind the lines, thousands of Soviet soldiers whispered prayers. They joked quietly. They cursed the generals. They argued over cards and dugouts. They shared letters from home. They vowed to hold. Each man remembered someone waiting, mother, child, lover. They had become defenders not just of land, but of memory. Meanwhile, German scouts noted changes. Recon flights returned with new imagery. Fields once flat now looked scarred, dotted with trenches. Wire lines glowed under infrared photography. Mines couldn't all be seen, but the density told the story. Somewhere in Berlin, intelligence reports spoke of defenses deeper than expected, belts stronger than calculated. But Hitler pressed on, and so the stage was set. Kursk was no longer open land. It was a fortress of earth and steel. 100,000 men inside it. Millions of traps. A landscape prepared to swallow any who tried crossing. At night, drivers of supply trucks on the rear roads, cams draped in foliage, shivered in their bunks. Their job was to keep the men fed, water given, bullets lined up. They whispered about what might come. Some said they dreamed of boots shifting above them. Some said they dreamed of summer days, sun on their faces. They tried to sleep. They couldn't. And then, as the first daylight of July arrived, a strange thing happened across the lines. The defenders heard distant thunder again. But this time it wasn't rain. It was preparation. Tanks moving in the distance. Engines warming. Guns being loaded. Sergeant Petrov looked across his wire at nothing, an open field. But he knew it was full. Full of patience, waiting. Medic Anna Orlova filled water jugs in a dugout by a cracked concrete bunker. She paused. She heard a rumble far away. She closed her eyes for a moment. The fortress had been built for this. But was it enough? Behind the belts, Coral inspected men firing wire into place. He wiped sweat and dirt from his face. Every face looked tired, grim. Yet he said quietly, "Hold fast. Hold tight." The moment drew near. The fortress had become more than soil and steel. It was a promise, a warning, a shield. And as dawn broke on the horizon, the defenders felt it in their bones. A siege was beginning, and the fortress would soon be tested. Chapter 7. Red Army Reinvented. New Tactics, New Confidence. The sky rained fire. Soviet soldiers ducked into shattered trenches. Above them, a German Stuka screamed in dive, then exploded onto earth with bone-shattering force. Men vanished in the dust. A radio crackled, Panzergruppe advancing. Fear surged. But amidst the chaos, something else surfaced. A steel calm. A growing certainty. The Red Army had changed. And at Kursk, they were no longer taught. They were shaping the fight. In 1941, the Red Army had been raw, poorly trained, worn by losses at the gates of Moscow and Leningrad. Entire divisions melted in the cauldron of Barbarossa. Commanders executed by decree. Supplies vanished. Equipment rusted. Morale broke. But over the next 2 years, each tragedy forged something different: resilience. By mid-1943, Soviet tactics had evolved. The High Command, Stalin, Zhukov, Vasilevsky, revamped training, elevated initiative in junior officers, built combined arms teams. This meant infantry, tanks, artillery, and air power coordinating like parts of a machine. Think of it as a dance. Dance rehearsed. Every partner knew the steps. Every beat mattered. It was no longer stumble and pray. It was precise, deadly choreography. At Stavka, the Soviet General Staff, lessons from Stalingrad and Kursk's earlier probes were seared into doctrine. Infantry squads trained to support tank crews. Sniper teams protected flanks. Artillery buried tanks before they reached trench lines. Combined arms became a symphony of destruction. In training camps, recruits learned to dig quickly. Trenches, foxholes, firing positions within minutes of landing. Veterans drilled them. They taught camouflage, concealment, and use of terrain. Tanks moved in small units, like wolves, flanking, circling, striking together. Pilots practiced close air support in mock battles. Engineers laid mines with discipline. Communications officers sent precise orders. Every part of the force knew its role. In the front lines before Kursk, morale was higher. Young soldiers carried letters from home in their pockets. They wrote songs in trenches. They fought with determination born of purpose. They had seen defeat, but they needed victory more. When German scouts reported Panther divisions massing west of Belgorod, Soviet tank captains whispered, "Let them come. We are ready." Men like Lieutenant Mikhailov led T-34 tanks with confidence, using the terrain to mask approaches. He relied on infantry to clear anti-tank ditches, then coordinated shell fire with artillery observers hidden in trees. Every kill was shared, every loss mourned, but every victory fueled belief. Commanders adapted too. Colonel Grigorev, overseeing a rifle corps, used defense in depth. That meant instead of one front line, they created layers, fire zones, reserves, traps. If Germans broke the first line, fine. They would march into the second. The third, they would be bleeding all the way. It was like fighting through levels in a game. Every layer slowed them down. Every layer cost them men. Soviet air power had grown as well. Ilyushin IL-2 Sturmovix, known as flying tanks, became staples of the ground offensive. Pilots flew low, strafing German armor, disrupting formations. They coordinated with ground observers, dropping bombs at critical moments. Anti-aircraft guns protected Soviet skies better. The Luftwaffe no longer owned the skies uncontested. All these lessons converged at Kursk. People like Captain Yelena Smirnova, a female radio operator, feared nothing by then. She intercepted messages under fire, passed them between squads. She carried codebooks in her kit. She had seen German orders exposed and tank columns rerouted. She knew her work mattered. By the day attack began, Soviet forces operating inside Kursk's salient numbered nearly 2 million. They were no longer victims. They became hunters, volunteers in sniper units. Many women picked off German officers. Tank crews ambushed panzers with sticky bombs and anti-tank rifles. Communication lines were buried underground so artillery could strike before enemy phones rang. Behind the front, political officers encouraged optimism. Commissars held morale sessions. Veterans spoke in dugouts. "We died at Stalingrad," they said, "but we will live at Kursk." Soldiers carved promises into trench walls. For motherland. For victory. Technology, too, had changed. The Soviets introduced new T-34 variants with better guns. Artillery units used rocket launchers, the famous Katyushas, to let loose volleys that shook the earthen belts. Engineers used mine rollers to breach anti-tank ditches. Signals troops used field telephones and radios linked to headquarters. When German intelligence detected these changes, nerves bounced in Berlin. Some reports warned that Soviet defense was no longer passive, that they would counterattack. Hitler dismissed them, too late. But Zhukov had already planned counterblows. Operations Kutuzov in the north, Rumyantsev in the south, ready to strike once Germans overextended. As July approached, the Soviet units inside the salient were not just dug in. They were alert, trained, practiced. Some veterans said a trickle of fear remained, but it was controlled. It sharpened focus. Not panic. Not rash courage. Iron discipline. On July 5th, German forces began artillery barrages. Yet Soviet defenses held. Trenches absorbed shells. Mines delayed tanks. Air attacks found flak buffers. Each layer delayed the onslaught. German tank columns stalled. German infantry faltered. And the Red Army watched. They didn't dance yet. They observed. They glided into gaps when they opened. They struck where Germans faltered. They pressed. In pockets where Panthers got stuck in ditches, where Tigers flamed from concealed Molotov cocktails, Soviet soldiers struck. They had hardened. They had learned. They were no longer uphill fighters. They were up to fight smart. In command bunkers, Zhukov received real-time reports. He saw the Germans bleeding. He waited for momentum to shift. When it did, the Soviets would hit back. The transformation of the Red Army was not seismic overnight. It was steady, built on sacrifice, forged in pain, sharpened by training. At Kursk, that new force stood not as the army that fled through 30-mile retreats, but as one that stood firm, learned, and would fight. And when German engines fired again, it was not the same Red Army that trembled. It was one reborn. But could they push back? Could their new tactics survive the storm? The answer would come in the days ahead. The gods of war were watching. Chapter 8, July 5, 1943, The German Hammer Falls. Before the sun had the chance to rise, before even the birds could break the silence, the steppe trembled. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't nature. It was the sound of war at its most unforgiving. At precisely 2:15 a.m. on July 5, 1943, the largest artillery bombardment the Eastern Front had yet seen erupted across the darkened horizon. Thousands of German guns, perfectly timed and precisely aimed, opened fire in unison, illuminating the night sky with flashes of fire and smoke. The ground itself seemed to shake. The air cracked. The line between heaven and hell blurred. The barrage was meant to be the beginning of a decisive German offensive, Operation Citadel, the plan to cut off the Kursk salient with a massive pincer strike from the north and south. Hitler believed this would change the course of the war. He believed it would restore momentum to a faltering Reich. But what followed in those early hours would instead ignite the beginning of the end. But the Soviets knew. They had known for weeks. Through an intricate web of spies, reconnaissance flights, intercepted communications, and captured documents, the Soviet High Command had pieced together the German plan. Zhukov, Vasilevsky, Rokossovsky, and the brilliant minds of the Red Army had prepared. And on that early July morning, the Red Army answered fire with fire. Just minutes before the German barrage began, Soviet artillery units had launched their own preemptive strike. It was a thunderous gamble, one that paid off. Caught off guard, German forward units began taking fire even as they prepared to advance. Ammunition trucks exploded before reaching the front. Command posts were shattered. In the eerie, pre-dawn gloom, the sky lit up with dueling firestorms, the most devastating artillery duel of the war to date. In the northern part of the salient, General Walter Model commanded Germany's Ninth Army. Known for his defensive genius, Model was now forced into a role he disliked, attacker. His goal was simple on paper: break through Soviet lines near the town of Panayrai and link up with Manstein's southern thrust, cutting off the massive Soviet bulge at its base. In reality, his objective led him directly into a fortress of Soviet defenses. The Germans launched their attack with more than 30 divisions, panzer, infantry, engineers. They had Tigers, Panthers, and deadly mobile artillery. But they were up against one of the most formidable defensive networks ever constructed. 10 lines of trenches and bunkers. Miles upon miles of anti-tank ditches. Over 400,000 mines laid across Model's axis of advance. Soviet defenses in the north were layered like a steel onion, each ring deeper and more brutal than the last. As Model's infantry pushed forward, they were swallowed by smoke, shrapnel, and machine gun fire. Soviet artillery, well-coordinated and dug in, punished every movement. Fields turned into mine-laced mazes. Barbed wire slowed charges to a crawl. And every hedge, every tree, every house concealed a sniper or anti-tank position. By noon, the battle reached the outskirts of Panayrai, a farming village that would soon be known as the Stalingrad of the North. Here, close-quarters fighting broke out inside homes, schools, and barns. The village changed hands multiple times in a single day. Soviet riflemen, armed with Molotovs and sheer resolve, refused to give ground. German tanks that reached the edge of Panerai were ambushed by dug-in Soviet guns firing from basements and alleyways. Entire buildings were reduced to rubble in hours. A small schoolhouse became the site of a desperate, 18-hour battle that saw over 400 dead. One German corporal later wrote in his diary, "We fought house to house, room to room. The floor was slippery with blood. I couldn't tell if it was mine." While the northern push stalled in mud and fire, the southern front under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein made more progress, but at terrible cost. Manstein's 4th Panzer Army and SS Panzer Corps brought some of the Wehrmacht's finest divisions. New weapons rolled forward, the Tiger I heavy tank and the Panther medium tank. With thick armor and powerful 88mm guns, they were the pride of the German war machine. The tanks roared across the fields south of Kursk, targeting the towns of Aboyan and Prokhorovka. And yet, again, they were slowed. Not just by Soviet firepower, but by the ground itself. Soviet engineers had flooded lowlands and destroyed bridges to hamper tank movement. The soil, dry one day and muddy the next, bogged down the German advance. Fields were seeded with mines. Trees were booby-trapped. Every ridge hid anti-tank guns. Every forest concealed a battalion. But Manstein pushed harder. His units broke through the first Soviet defensive belt and reached the second. For a moment, it seemed like a breakthrough might be possible. But then, the Soviet Air Force arrived. Unlike in 1941, the VVS, the Soviet Air Force, was ready. Yak-9s and La-5s dogfought with German Messerschmitts. But the real terror came from above. The Il-2 Sturmovik, nicknamed the Flying Tank. With rocket pods under its wings and armor plating under its belly, the Il-2 swooped low over German armored columns. They unleashed hell on convoys, artillery parks, and fuel depots. Infantry on the move had no protection from its thunder. Dozens of sorties were flown every hour. One German officer, hiding under a burning half-track, wrote, "The sun never rose on July 5th. The Il-2s took its place." As tanks burned and forests turned to ash, it was the Soviet soldier, the Red Army infantryman, who held the line. These men fought from trenches that had taken months to dig. They wore patched uniforms. Many carried worn rifles from earlier in the war. Some had no helmets. But they had orders, hold or die, and they held. They fought with machine guns, grenades, bayonets, and fists. Some waited silently in foxholes as tigers rolled overhead, then rose to attack their underbellies with Molotovs or bundled grenades. When ammunition ran low, soldiers charged with sharpened spades or bayonets. In one trench sector, Soviet troops, entirely surrounded, held off a German company with nothing but captured rifles and their bare hands. By nightfall, the first day of Operation Citadel had passed, and despite all their preparations, the German advance had failed to break through. Back in Berlin, Hitler grew restless. He had expected a breakthrough in 24 hours. Instead, both fronts had bogged down. He asked his generals, what happened? But Manstein still believed. He argued that the breakthrough was close, especially in the south. He begged for time, for reinforcements, for fuel. Just one more push, he promised. Hitler wavered. But in Moscow, Stalin did not. He watched with cold satisfaction as the German attack stalled. His trap had worked. The defenses held. And behind them, out of sight, out of reach, waited the real blow, the Soviet counterattack. Because this was only the beginning. Kursk was not decided in a day. The world's largest tank battle had not even begun. But as July 5th ended, the tide of war shifted. The Wehrmacht had fired its first, best shot, and it had not been enough. Chapter 9, Clash at the Northern Shoulder, Model's Bloody Push. The explosion lifted the Panther tank clear off the ground, its turrets spinning in the air like a twisted coin of death. When it slammed back down, flames already licking out from the hatches, there were no screams. Just silence. Then, the whine of another Soviet shell cutting through the trees. The ground around Kursk wasn't just soil anymore. It was a furnace, swallowing metal and men alike. This was the northern shoulder of the Kursk salient. July 5, 1943. Here, in the rolling fields and dense woods north of the city, General Walter Model's Ninth Army began its assault. It was supposed to be a pincer movement. Clean, swift, coordinated with von Manstein's southern thrust. But instead of cutting through, Model's forces crashed into a wall of steel, fire, and resolve. The northern advance didn't slice, it bled. Model, known as the defensive genius of the Wehrmacht, was now on the offensive. He had under his command over 300,000 men, hundreds of tanks, and wave upon wave of artillery. His objective was simple in theory: break through Soviet lines, meet Manstein in the south, and encircle the Red Army units trapped inside the bulge. But the Soviets had seen it coming. What the Germans didn't know, or didn't want to believe, was that the Soviets had been watching, listening, preparing. The Red Army had dug in like never before. Minefields the size of cities. Trenches layered like the rings of an ancient fortress. Anti-tank guns hidden in every fold of the landscape. And the forests, they were alive with Soviet soldiers, engineers, snipers, all waiting. Model's first strike came near Panai, a small town that would soon become a name whispered like Stalingrad, at least for those who survived it. At dawn, the German barrage began. Artillery shells screamed overhead, smashing into Soviet lines. Then, waves of infantry surged forward. They made it through the first belt of defenses, but just barely. That was only the beginning. Panai was next. What happened there wasn't battle. It was butchery. House to house, room to room. The schoolhouse changed hands no less than 14 times in a single day. Soviet riflemen used crawl spaces to flank tanks. Germans hurled grenades into basements, only to find more Russians rising from the ruins. A sergeant described it as a place where even the rats had no safe corner. Blood seeped into the bricks. The air stank of ash and iron. Tiger tanks finally rolled in to support the infantry, but even they struggled. Soviet gunners had learned where to aim, between the tracks, at the joints, under the turret. German crews radioed back. Too many guns. They're everywhere. It's like fighting ghosts in a graveyard. And then came the mines. Over 400,000 mines had been buried across Model's axis of advance. Anti-personnel, anti-tank, even improvised charges. The ground itself rebelled with every step. One wrong move, and an entire squad vanished in a fireball. German engineers, tasked with clearing paths, were the first to die. They worked with trembling hands, sweat pouring down their necks, whispering prayers in the moments between each careful movement. By the second day, Panther tanks, Germany's newest and most powerful, began arriving. But they came with a cruel twist. Mechanical issues plagued them. Gearboxes failed. Engines overheated. Out of 184 Panthers, more than half were out of action within 48 hours. Some never even reached the front. Others broke down under fire, sitting ducks for Soviet gunners. For the German crews inside, their steel beasts had become coffins with treads. Still, Model pushed. He had no choice. Each mile of advance came at a horrific cost. Bodies lay tangled in the ditches. Medics worked with bare hands and too little morphine. A German officer wrote in his journal, "We gain one field. We lose 200 men. Is this victory?" Meanwhile, the Soviets were not just surviving, they were adapting. General Rokossovsky, commanding the Central Front, moved his reserves with eerie precision. Where gaps opened, reinforcements poured in. Where tanks stalled, new trenches rose. His soldiers, many of whom had fought at Moscow and Stalingrad, dug in with fanatical resolve. They knew this was the line. This was where it stopped. For the Soviet troops in the trenches, the battle was personal. They fought for their homes, their families, for every burnt village behind them. Some hadn't slept in days. Others hadn't eaten. But they held. A Soviet conscript recalled, "When the tanks came, we didn't run. We loaded our rifles and aimed, even if it was our last shot." By July 7th, the German Ninth Army had advanced just a few miles. They were supposed to have broken through 3 Soviet defensive lines by now. Instead, they were still entangled in the second. The Alkavatka Ridge stood like a wall ahead of them, bristling with guns, lined with bunkers, manned by soldiers who refused to bend. And yet, Model kept going. He ordered fresh assaults, threw more men into the grinder. Communications began to break down. Tanks ran out of fuel. Infantry units were cut off, surrounded, then wiped out. Still, Berlin demanded progress. In a bunker near the front, a Soviet radio operator tapped out a message. Germans stuck. Advance stalled. We hold. By July 9th, Model had to face the truth. The northern push was dying, not because of lack of courage, but because the plan had never accounted for this level of resistance, this depth of defense, this iron will. But the cost was immense for both sides. Panirai was now just rubble. The forests were graveyards. Entire regiments ceased to exist. And yet, neither side stepped back. For the Germans, morale faltered. Letters home became shorter, darker. A young private scrawled, "Tell mother I tried. Tell her I saw the sun rise one more time." His letter was found in his pocket 2 days later. He had died beside a burnt-out Panzer IV, his helmet split open. For the Soviets, each day of survival was a small victory. They weren't just holding a line. They were draining the enemy, hour by hour. But the story wasn't over. Because while Model struggled in the north, something stirred in the south. Von Manstein's forces were closing in on a critical point, one that might change the tide. And far to the east, Marshal Zhukov was watching it all, preparing his own response. A response that would not just stop the Germans, but break them. The trap was still forming, and the center was still holding. The question now was not who would win, but how many more would die before the truth became clear. The push had begun with fire. It would end in steel and silence. Chapter 10, The Southern Spear, Hoth's Advance Toward Prokhorovka. A Soviet T-34 erupted in flames. Its turret flew off like shattered glass. Survivors dragged burning men from the wreckage. That was mid-July, on the southern flank of Kursk. Germany's armored spearhead, led by General Hoth under Manstein's 4th Panzer Army, had punched deep into Soviet lines. Dozens of tanks roared across open fields. But violence came with a price. By sunset, fields lay black, tracks severed, and the cost of advance had begun to outpace the gain. The spearhead had cut in, but at what cost to the hand that wielded it? In the early hours of July 5th, Manstein's southern forces moved through Belgorod toward Prokhorovka, hoping to slice through the southern shoulder of the Kursk salient. Manstein's strategy relied on speed and massed armor, Panthers, Tigers, and mechanized infantry, swarming forward like a tide of steel. At first, it looked unstoppable. German units advanced nearly 30 miles, crushing Soviet outposts, overrunning villages, and capturing key crossroads. German field reports spoke of momentum. They spoke of final victory. Yet beneath that success lay mounting danger. The terrain was deceptive. Wide fields gave way to muddy ravines. Rivers cut into progress. Bridges had been blown by Soviet engineers. And the closer German columns approached Prokhorovka, the deeper the Soviet trap revealed itself. Minefields arrived in clusters like landmines waiting to strike. Anti-tank ditches turned into chasms. Trenches bristled with Soviet infantry linked tightly to anti-tank guns and artillery. Every mile gained demanded sacrifice. Among the German armored commanders was Oberstleutnant Hermann, a veteran panzer officer. He steered a Tiger through dust and fire. When he passed through the village of Prokhorovka, blood on his hands and mud on his boots, he felt the first real doubt. His chest tightened. This was not Blitzkrieg. This was attrition. Every step forward, an echo of a loss behind. Soviet troops, by contrast, dug in like iron. Veterans of Stalingrad and Kharkiv took positions at Prokhorovka in layers, tank corps, rifle divisions, artillery units, ready to strike the armored spearhead at its narrowest point. A former Stalingrad survivor, Sergeant Ivan, crawled through trenches beneath shell-shocked trees. He remembered frozen fields and starving men. But here, he felt different, purposeful. When German armor roared near, he pressed the button on his anti-tank rifle and prayed. As German columns neared Prokhorovka, Luftwaffe air support, Junkers and Focke-Wulfs, swooped down to clear the sky. They strafed Soviet armored formations, bombed trenches. Yet Soviet flak guns and IL-2 flying tanks rose to challenge them. Bombs exploded near tanks. Bombs destroyed fuel dumps. Soldiers sheltered beneath overturned hulls. Each airstrike gained ground, but lost more pilots and machines than expected. When Panther units reached the edge of Prokhorovka's defensive belts, they encountered Soviet artillery arrays designed to punch through armored formations. Over 200 guns opened fire simultaneously. Shell bursts shredded tracks, ignited engines, shattered vision blocks. Panthers floored to cross wide fields, simply burned or halted. Tanks clustered, became easy targets. Mechanized infantry found themselves running into crossfire without cover. The fierce advance brought tragedy as well. German forward units, far ahead of support lines, found themselves isolated in burning fields. A platoon of Panzer Grenadiers, armored infantry riding behind tanks, stepped onto a minefield. 15 men disappeared in seconds. Their screams heard across the shells. The rest made little progress. Command radios crackled with desperate calls. Fall back. Need extraction. But for many, there was nowhere to go. Loss of fuel and spare parts became a real threat. The deeper into Soviet territory, the longer the supply line stretched. Supply trucks stuck in mud. Bridges wrecked. Fuel convoys turned into target zones. German logistical officers counted tanks left alive, and fewer came forward. Panther and Tiger breakdowns increasingly matched battle losses. Hoth's spearhead was bleeding from within. By July 7th, German forces had driven deeper but reached the 3rd Soviet defensive belt. Here the lines closed in. Soviet tanks, fresh, reinforced, arrived on schedule. Tank crews in T-34s attacked in coordinated waves, targeting flanks and rear armor of German panzers. In one valley, German armor formed defensive screens. 2 Soviet tanks slipped behind and attacked their flanks. A sudden explosion. Silence. In command bunkers, Manstein stared at maps marked in red and blue, each mark a battalion or tank destroyed. He watched his men fight valiantly, but saw the advance slowing. His reports to Berlin noted increasing fuel shortages, decreasing reserves. He requested more. He expected more. But Hitler held back reinforcements, demanding breakthrough. German morale in the southern spearhead wavered. Soldiers began to whisper. Victory would depend on one final charge at Prokhorovka, and that charge was still days away. Prokhorovka lay ahead, not just a village, but the hinge on which this entire assault turned. It was where German steel might slice through, or Soviet fire might break them. Men on both sides sensed the moment. Soviet Commissar Petrov gathered T-34 crews beside fresh oil barrels. "Hold here," he told them softly. "Hit them when they arrive." A tank commander, no more than 24, looked up, face grim. "We know this ground. Let them earn it." German tank commanders whispered to their gunners. "We will clear that field. After that, Kursk falls." But each tank burned. Each driver stepped deeper into a trap. Their radio channels crackled with lost reports, not coordination. And though German armor had advanced 30 miles, each mile was soaked in casualties. Tank commanders mourned crew killed by mines. Infantrymen carried letters home from men who would never return. Each bullet-punched hull and mangled turret counted. As July 8th arrived, Prokhorovka grew closer. Smoke rose on the horizon. The fields glowed with distant flame. Behind the lines, Soviet reinforcements, tank destroyer units, self-propelled guns, marched toward the same goal. They brought Sturmovix, Katyusha rocket launchers, fresh rifle divisions, and deep forces under Zhukov's control readied counterattacks. The stage was nearly set for the largest tank clash in history. But on both sides, exhaustion and expectation warred silently. Could Hoth break through and collapse the southern defense? Or would Soviet layers stop the spearhead in its tracks and turn it into fodder? The dust over Prokhorovka fogged the horizon. The roar of engines approached. And somewhere ahead, the bullets were waiting. Chapter 11. War Machines Unleashed. Tigers, Panthers, and Ferdinands. The turret of a Tiger tank spun off in a fiery arc, its crew silenced in an instant. Around it, iron giants lay crippled, tanks meant to dominate, but instead immobilized by muddy ground or mysterious mechanical failure. That moment, horrific, powerful, was the brutal introduction to Germany's new war machines at Kursk. The tools of Blitzkrieg now betrayed their creators. The grand design began to crack. Germany's gamble at Kursk rested on three new beasts: the Tiger I heavy tank, the Panther medium tank, and the Ferdinand tank destroyer. Each was a marvel of engineering, or so Hitler claimed. But in the fields of Kursk, mechanics proved as deadly as enemy guns. The Tiger I, with its 88mm gun and thick armor, was a fortress on treads, capable of destroying a Soviet T-34 at over 2,000 meters. To German crews, it was the invincible. Yet weight was its curse. On rough ground, mud and ice jammed road wheels. Tracks snapped under stress. Engines overheated. The offensive often moved slower than infantry. Many Tigers broke down before ever seeing Soviet fire. The Panther boasted sloped armor, a 75mm high-velocity gun, and superior mobility. It seemed the perfect answer to the T-34. But early models suffered breakdowns. Transmissions failed. Engines caught fire. Untrained crews struggled to repair them under combat pressure. Of 200 Panthers that advanced in the first days, perhaps 50 remained functional by day 2. Within 5 days, fewer than 10 still moved across the battlefield. The rest lay abandoned or burned out in muddy fields. Then there was the Ferdinand, later renamed Elephant, a tank destroyer built upon a failed chassis and armed with a long-range 88mm Pak-43. It had no turret. It had no secondary armament for close defense. It weighed nearly 70 tons. In theory, it was unstoppable. In practice, it was a coffin if immobilized. Mines detonated tracks. Engine fires consumed machinery. Companies destroyed their own Ferdinands to avoid capture. Crews suffocated inside metal tubes that could not move. Still, these machines did kill. One unit destroyed over 300 Soviet tanks. Another claimed more than 500. But each success came at tremendous cost. Many of those lost were due to mechanical failure, not enemy fire. Crews abandoned tanks deep in no man's land. Without turret weapons, infantry swarmed immobilized vehicles. Recovery teams couldn't tow 70-ton hulks. Many were destroyed on the spot. Soviet responses were swift and brutal. They deployed Su-152 heavy assault guns equipped with massive 152mm howitzers. Rough to load and slow to fire, these were nicknamed beast killers. When a Ferdinand halted, 1 or 2 Su-152s could kill it with a single devastating shot, destroying crew interiors while leaving the hull intact. Crews bled inside shells, silent and trapped. Tank crews adapted too. They targeted weak points: tracks, suspension, engine compartments. A single mine strike could disable a Panther. Soviet riflemen or Su-152 teams moved in to finish the job. They lobbed Molotov cocktails through vision slits. Crews trapped inside often died without firing another shell. Tiger crews suffered similar fate. Although mechanically more reliable than Panthers, they were few. Only around 1,300 were built during the war, and only a fraction reached Kursk. Those that did often broke down under their own weight. They became sitting targets, unmovable and vulnerable. On the German side, commanders felt pressure mounting. One major in command of a Ferdinand battalion reported the absence of defensive weapons. Crews improvised by firing their machine guns through the main gun bore. Others mounted rifles and hull slits. These improvisations spoke less of design brilliance and more of desperation. Despite everything, German propaganda still celebrated these machines as symbols of invincibility. But on the ground, morale sank. A Panther crew radioed from mud. "We broke through only to be buried." The vehicles, once emblems of power, now symbolized overreach. Roll call of wrecks was sobering. Smoke drifted across destroyed tanks. Rubble of metal dotted fields like gravestones. Each Panther, Tiger, or Ferdinand lost was a testament to failure of logistics and planning as much as enemy fire. Soviet forces grew more confident with each wreck examined. They studied every disabled machine, noted failure points, and revised tactics. They flooded roads to bog down heavy armor. They set traps where Germans advanced. Engineers simulated German machine gun sites to train anti-tank teams. Each breakdown or blunder became a lesson. At field hospitals, doctors treated tank crew injuries, burns, shrapnel, broken bones. They spoke quietly. Hit by mine, burned by engine fire. German letters home, found in pockets, spoke of betrayal, not from enemies, but from steel meant to protect. On the Soviet side, each destroyed German heavyweight was a memento. Too big to move, too helpless to win, whispered tank crews. In one captured Ferdinand, Soviets discovered no defensive armament inside, just empty shells and dead silence. At dawn over Kursk fields, smoke rose across battered terrain. German vehicles lay scattered, blackened, abandoned. Troops marched past silently, avoiding broken hulk shadows that once promised dominance but delivered ruin. Hitler's hope for armored supremacy lay in ruins. Panther speed failed. Tiger resilience faltered. Ferdinand's froze. Mechanical failure, Soviet tactics, and battlefield exhaustion turned these war machines into monuments of loss. And yet, the war machine ground on. Because what had been unleashed could still kill. But now it was outmatched. The armored titans had roared, and Kursk had begun to strip them of power. The battlefield's next act was about to start. A deadly pivot towards Soviet counterattack. Chapter 12. Mines, Mud, and Mayhem, slowing the Blitzkrieg. The ground exploded beneath a German tank column. In an instant, the seemingly unstoppable Blitzkrieg stumbled, crippled not by enemy fire, but by the very earth beneath them. Minefields, invisible and relentless, ripped through treads, shattered hulls, and turned armor into wreckage. Smoke coiled into the sky. The spearhead had been blunted. Across the Kursk salient, the Soviet Union had transformed the battlefield into a fortress. Not a fortress of concrete, but of steel teeth buried in soil. Over 500,000 anti-tank mines, and hundreds of thousands more anti-personnel ones, had been sown across the steppe. In some areas, there were over 1,500 mines per kilometer, more than 4 times what had been used to defend Moscow. And this was only the beginning. Behind the mines lay a second enemy, the terrain itself. Trenches stretching over 4,000 kilometers crisscrossed the battlefield, forming deadly labyrinths. Anti-tank ditches yawned like open graves. The Germans weren't just fighting men anymore. They were fighting the land. Engineers tried to clear the way. Goliath demolition vehicles and boardward IVs crept forward, remote-controlled, meant to clear paths through the explosives. But Soviet gunners were waiting. The machines were too slow, too fragile. Most were destroyed before they reached their targets. Every cleared path came at a terrible cost. Engineers crawled under fire, probing for pressure plates and tripwires. Every mistake ended in death. And even when lanes were cleared, Soviet combat engineers returned under the cover of darkness, replanting the fields, replacing the mines, making the land deadly once again. And then came the mud. Rain turned the steppe into a swamp. German tanks, Panthers, Tigers, even the fearsome Ferdinand tank destroyers, sank into the muck. Their engines screamed. Their tracks spun, but the mud held them fast. Panthers became coffins. Tigers became targets. One by one, vehicles stalled. Tracks snapped. Gears jammed. What wasn't immobilized by mines was swallowed by the earth itself. A machine designed for speed now crawled. Helpless, heavy, vulnerable. The German Ninth Army, striking from the north, advanced barely 10 kilometers in the first few days. In the south, despite all efforts, progress stalled at the outskirts of Panirai, a small town, now a fortress of its own. By sundown on July 5th, the Germans had suffered thousands of casualties, over 1,200 men killed or missing, and nearly 6,000 wounded. It was a slaughter. Entire tank companies were lost in a single minefield. The elite Grossdeutschland division lost 36 Panthers in one day, most not to enemy fire, but to immobility. Crews abandoned them, retreating on foot, while Soviet artillery rained fire on the wreckage. And still, the Soviets weren't done. Each defensive belt fed into another. Trenches led to bunkers. Bunkers covered minefields. And always, there were more reserves. Soviet riflemen repaired defenses by night. Anti-tank teams repositioned. New mines were laid before the Germans could press forward. By July 12th, the Germans had barely broken through two belts. In the north, their maximum advance stalled at 8 to 10 miles. In the south, Manstein's forces made it 30 miles, but at staggering cost. Momentum was gone. The Blitzkrieg was bleeding. German commanders radioed Berlin in frustration. "We advance by inches," one tank commander reported, "and we bleed by hundreds." The Soviets, in contrast, stood firm. They knew the land. They had shaped it. And now, they used it as their weapon. Mud, mines, trenches, ditches. Not glamorous, not fast, but brutally effective. As Soviet reserves gathered in the distance, fresh tanks, fresh infantry, fresh artillery, the German spearhead began to snap. The trap was closing. The counterblow was coming. And the myth of Blitzkrieg was crumbling in the fields of Kursk. Chapter 13. Hell at Prokhorovka, the greatest tank battle. Steel lightning struck first. A row of Soviet T-34s charged across an open field, and in an instant, German Panthers lurched sideways, tracks shredded by hidden fire. Flames flickered across mud and iron. Men inside tanks didn't scream, they shouted orders. Then silence. Metal ovens engulfed their final moments. It was July 12, 1943. At Prokhorovka, history would be written in steel, dust, and blood. The SS Panzer Corps under Manstein collided head-on with the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army. Two forces honed for victory, now locked in the fiercest armored clash ever seen. At the heart of the southern shoulder of the Kursk salient, over 1,000 tanks thundered across fields scorched by artillery. The roar was deafening. The sky, choked with smoke and tracer fire, became a battlefield of its own. German commanders believed the SS Panzer Corps, elite SS divisions like Leibstandard, Das Reich, Totenkopf, would smash through Soviet defenses as they had in past campaigns. They moved their trophy weapons forward, Panthers, Tigers, and the feared Ferdinand tank destroyers. Their goal was simple: break through at Prokhorovka, cut the Soviet flank, and collapse the southern bulge. But the Soviets had reserves hidden just behind those lines. The 5th Guards Tank Army, fresh and ferocious, was waiting. They charged forward in waves of T-34s, supported by Su-152 assault guns. This was no defensive holding. This was a strike back with everything they had. The dance began in daylight. Tanks rolled across a field of death a few kilometers wide, tracks meeting tracks. Machine guns spat, shells screamed. In minutes, that field disappeared into wrecked steel, burning tracks, and dust. Visibility dropped. Orders were lost. Fire became chaotic. Guns fired blindly. Crews dismounted to reload under fire. Smoke burned lungs. Men shouted names of the tanks they rode in, names they whispered at home. At Prokhorovka, a German Tiger commander wrote in his log, "We charged 3 tanks abreast. We struck Soviet flank. Then we sat. Guns jammed. Engines overheated. We burned." His unit lost half its strength before sunset. Across the same field, Soviet trolleys rolled into the fight with grim calm. A Soviet tanker carved for Stalingrad into his T-34s side. Another, wounded in the hatch, bandaged himself and climbed back in. Within hours, the battlefield resembled a forest of twisted iron. Tracks waved in the wind. Turrets lay torn from hulls. Flame-gutted barrels. Pools of oil and water bubbled near dead tanks. Engineers fired flares into the smoke, hoping to call in artillery support. Mortars lobbed rounds over wrecked tanks at enemy crew clustered behind them, every tactic desperate. German anti-tank teams worked under burning hulls, fixing tracks just to move forward again. Soviet gunners crawled under destroyed treads to position Molotov cocktails. Every tank was a fortress or a grave. Every survivor became legend. Miraculously, The Germans held ground. They prevented full breakthrough. But the cost was brutal. Over 200 German tanks were destroyed, disabled, or abandoned that day. Soviet losses were similar in numbers. Yet the strategic outcome was clear. Prokhorovka did not fall, and German spearhead lost its edge. As dusk fell, both sides paused, if only to catch breath. German SS officers radioed Berlin, advance halted. Too many losses. Manstein relayed. Our panzers cannot move further. In Moscow, Zhukov heard. German armor stuck in field. A grim nod passed among commanders. The trap held. Survivors exhausted, raged silently. A Soviet gunner lit a cigarette beside a burning Tiger turret, heart thumping behind chipped armor. A German panzer grenadier crawled out from under a Panther and vomited on the scorched ground. Letters stuffed in pocket, some unsent, bore names of mothers, wives, children. These faces of war were real. They lived. They died. They counted. Prokhorovka was not the end. It was the breaking point, the turning of the tide. German armor had been slowed, fragmented, drained. The Soviet counterblows pressing from behind would soon hammer home. The fields of Kursk would flow with movement. No longer German thrust, but Soviet push. The clash at Prokhorovka proved that Blitzkrieg could falter. That terrain, preparation, and armored grit could blunt steel. That hope alone did not win wars, endurance did. The next act was waiting. The Soviet hammer would fall. Chapter 14, Skies of Fire. Air War over Kursk. The sky turned into hell. German fighters dove with screaming engines, their tracers lighting the clouds on fire. Explosions bloomed below as Soviet tanks burned and artillery positions vanished in flame. On July 5, 1943, the Battle of Kursk began not just on the ground, but in the air. Above the largest tank battle in history, unfolded the largest aerial clash the world had ever seen. Germany threw nearly 1,787 aircraft into Operation Citadel. They stripped the skies of Italy and the Mediterranean to bolster their force, sending their best squadrons to the Eastern Front. But they were outmatched. The Soviets had prepared over 3,000 aircraft, including 1,400 fighters, and by mid-July, that number surged to over 5,000, overwhelming the Luftwaffe in both numbers and endurance. The skies, like the earth below, were turned into a battlefield of attrition. On the first day, German pilots flew over 3,300 sorties, mostly in the southern sector, providing vital cover for SS panzer divisions punching through Soviet lines. These early missions were brutally effective. German bombers pounded dugouts, while fighters cleared the skies above advancing tanks. But every victory came at a cost. Fuel was scarce. Spare parts were dwindling. Every flight meant risking the last working engine. Soviet pilots were younger, often barely trained. Their aircraft, Yaks and La-5s, were technically inferior to the German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. But they had numbers, bravery, and evolving tactics. They flew in groups, adapted quickly, and learned to cover each other. And then, there were the IL-2 Sturmovix, nicknamed flying tanks. These heavily armored ground attack planes were built to take punishment and deliver death. They became a nightmare for German troops below. The Soviets deployed their IL-2s in what became known as the Circle of Death. Groups of 8 or more flew in constant loops, each aircraft guarding the one ahead. When one peeled off to dive, unleash rockets or cannons, it was instantly replaced in formation. German anti-aircraft gunners watched helplessly as the sky rained steel. In one deadly raid on July 7th, 70 German tanks were reportedly destroyed in just 20 minutes. The psychological effect on German ground forces was devastating. But despite these victories, air power alone didn't win the battle. In fact, studies suggest only 2 to 5% of German tank losses at Kursk came from air attacks. Most fell to mines, anti-tank rifles, artillery, or simply broke down. Still, the IL-2's presence shaped the battlefield. Every time German tanks advanced, they risked the wrath of the Sturmovix. Every fuel convoy, every artillery battery became a target. Luftwaffe pilots, Many of them seasoned aces, still racked up kills. On July 5th alone, they claimed over 220 Soviet aircraft. But the losses were mutual. That day, the Germans lost 55 aircraft and 20 elite pilots. Soviet losses were even heavier, over 500 planes in the first days, but they had replacements. Germany didn't. Their squadrons were stretched thin. Their pilots flew multiple missions a day, exhausted and under constant stress. By July 10th, the Luftwaffe was bleeding. Aircraft were grounded for lack of parts. Pilots flew with minimal rest. Fuel shortages meant some missions were canceled altogether. German generals on the ground begged for more air support, but it simply wasn't there. The skies that once belonged to the Luftwaffe were now contested, and soon they would belong to the Red Air Force alone. Soviet coordination also improved dramatically. Radio teams worked closely with ground units to time airstrikes with artillery and infantry movements. Soviet fighters began escorting IL-2s with layered formations, fighters above, fighters below. German fighters found it harder to ambush them. Soviet bombers began hitting Luftwaffe airfields and supply lines. The air war was no longer about dogfights. It was about strategy, and it was working. At Prokhorovka, during one of the largest tank clashes in history, Soviet aircraft made up for what they lacked in precision with sheer fury. Waves of IL-2s screamed down on German armor, while Yak and La-5 fighters kept the Luftwaffe at bay. A Soviet tanker recalled looking up through the smoke and spotting a lone Sturmovik above, circling, hunting. He smiled. For once, the sky was on their side. By mid-July, Soviet air superiority was clear. German aircraft were fewer, slower to respond, and often overwhelmed. Hitler's decision to halt Operation Citadel on July 12 was shaped not just by the Allied invasion of Sicily, but by the Luftwaffe's inability to dominate the skies over Kursk. Without air cover, German tanks were exposed. Without fuel and ammunition, they were helpless. Without the skies, they could not win. The Battle of Kursk wasn't decided in one place. It was decided in trenches, in minefields, in forests, and far above, where fire met steel in mid-air duels. The Soviet Air Force paid a terrible price in blood and machines. But by the end, they had achieved the unthinkable. They had beaten the Luftwaffe, not just with planes, but with strategy, numbers, and will. Above the fields of Kursk, the sky belonged to the Red Star. Chapter 15, Stalemate in the North. A Panther tank ground to a halt, its tracks shredded, its engine silent. The crew crawled into foxholes, only to be cut down by Soviet artillery. The German advance had died, not with a bang, but under its own weight. Momentum vanished. General Walter Model's Ninth Army, pushing from the north shoulder of the Kursk salient, aimed for the Alkavakka Ridge. The goal was to break Soviet lines and meet the southern pincer. Instead, they met trenches carved into the earth, minefields so dense they resembled walls, and artillery waiting for them like silent predators. By July 8th, the advance had slowed to mere hundreds of meters each day. By July 10th, it had completely stalled. Fighting at Panayrai Station and along the ridge turned into a grinding nightmare. German infantry captured half the village in bloody street battles, only to be pushed back the next morning. Soldiers described it as a miniature Stalingrad. Every building was a fortress, every street a death trap. Losses mounted rapidly. Between July 1st and 10th, the Ninth Army and supporting panzer units lost more than 21,000 men. In the weeks that followed, another 62,000 casualties further drained strength and morale. Then came the Soviet counterpunch. On July 6th, General Katukov's 16th Tank Corps charged German lines with nearly 1,900 tanks, forcing Model to redeploy Panther divisions and infantry units to plug gaps. The shock unsettled the German rear and disrupted logistics. Simultaneously, Marshal Rokossovsky ordered coordinated assaults by rifle divisions and artillery behind Panayrai. German engineers welded rails into anti-tank traps. Farmers were relocated, fields burned, to slow the Red Army advance. But Soviet pressure intensified. Communications faltered, ammunition ran low, fuel vanished. By July 9th, Model acknowledged defeat. His forces had not broken through. They remained intact, but the initiative had slipped. Behind his lines, Operation Kutuzov loomed. On July 12th, the Central Front, reinforced by Bryansk and Western Front armies, attacked the Ural salient from the rear, threatening to envelop the Ninth Army. Model's men dug new defensive lines, burned villages ahead of retreat routes, and attempted scorched earth tactics. Yet Soviet reserves slipped past, cutting supply lines and tightening the noose. One German tank commander radioed, "We hold ground once won, but it costs more than victory ever would." In Moscow, Stavka watched grimly. German armored strength had halved. Infantry morale crumbled. Reports described Model's lines sagging under relentless Soviet pressure. Soviet forces crept closer each night, pushing from the east and south simultaneously. The offensive had stalled. Supplies lagged. Reinforcements were delayed. And now the Soviet counteroffensive was rolling forward. The German spear had lost its tip. The ground turned against the Wehrmacht. And at Ural, the hammer was striking back hard. Chapter 16, German Exhaustion, Soviet Momentum. A fuel truck exploded under a hail of mortar fire. Flames engulfed armored transports. Behind them, German tanks ground to a halt. Rations ended. Crews stared into empty engines, empty hopes. The spearhead had bled itself dry. By mid-July, Operation Citadel was dying, not from defeat, but from exhaustion. German supply lines vanquished by Soviet fighters and damaged railroads. Fuel convoys stranded in minefields. Spare parts vanished. There simply wasn't enough lifeline to feed the armored tooth. In the north, Model's Ninth Army existed in ghosts. Half the tanks stared mute in fields, their tracks removed. Panzer units ran dry. Soldiers carried handfuls of shells and dateless boxes. Air support, once promised, dwindled into silence. German pilots flew sorties with battered planes, in circles over fields they could no longer support. At headquarters, officers counted tanks still mobile and dared not admit how few remained. In the south, von Manstein's 4th Panzer Army fought a mirror nightmare. Panthers that roared into Prokhorovka stopped rolling. Tigers burned from Molotovs and artillery. Ferdinand sat abandoned, stripped for parts. On July 14th, German records show only 10 operational Panthers remained on that flank. Crews scavenged fuel from abandoned vehicles. Engineers cannibalized tracks just to move one tank a few yards. Meanwhile, the Soviets surged. Stavka, the Soviet General Staff, deployed reserves in waves. Yakovlev's and Iltwes shredded German supply roads. Artillery smashed rail ties. Soviet tank armies pressed forward. On July 13th, Marshal Zhukov ordered Tank Corps to advance from newly seized ground, linking defenses with counteroffensive punch. Momentum shifted. Each new Soviet thrust revealed fresh supply breakdowns in German camps. Ammunition ran out. Food spoiled. Water supplies contaminated. Infectious diseases spread through tank crews who rode in waterlogged hulls. Morale cracked. At a field hospital near Belgorod, Capo diaries recorded, men arrived with faces haunted, not by enemy guns, but with hunger and panic. Tiger crew clusters prayed silently before battle, an unusual knee bent to absence of petrol, not fate. Soviet patrols inside German rear areas reported enemy columns stopped dead. Infantry without boots. Vehicles frozen in mud. Soviet engineers exploited these gaps, planting mines where tracks had left prints, turning every retreat into fresh slaughter. Attrition steadily stripped Germany's weapon edge. German commanders stopped expecting breakthroughs. Instead, they counted minutes until supply columns arrived. The advance had slowed to inches. In Moscow, the Stavka smiled grimly at these stalling jaws. As the German spearhead vanished under weight of loss, Soviet fronts regained momentum. Tanks that had waited behind lines surged into gaps. Artillery axes split German positions. Soldiers rallied under red flags again. On the evening of July 17th, the final blow was signaled. Manstein, exhausted and embittered, reported to Berlin, "No fuel." No tanks. No hope for breakthrough. Model offered a single phrase: Citadel has run its course. The Führer retreated into silence. But Soviet machines did not stop. At dawn on July 18th, Soviet counteroffensive operations swept across the Kursk front. Tank armies plunged through German artillery belts. Rifle divisions assaulted bunkers with grenades and bones. German positions collapsed. In German dugouts, men wrote farewell letters. They scratched names of home into helmets, thinking retreat near. Those who survived the battle returned with eyes hollowed. Their weapons remained, but lacked the power to move. The battlefield lurched toward reversal. German forces were bending, fracturing, not shattered overnight, but lost to the slow toll of logistics and blood. Soviet hands, steady and organized, clenched the advantage. And still, Kursk had not ended. Because ahead loomed Operation Kutuzov, Operation Rumyantsev, and the long Soviet drive westward. But for now, at Citadel's end, exhaustion and endurance had turned the tide. Germany had fired its last shot, and the Soviets were ready to answer. Chapter 17. The moment Hitler blinked. The radio crackled in Hitler's bunker. A single phrase shattered the calm: Allied landings in Sicily. The words hung in the stale air like a death sentence. In that moment, everything changed. After weeks of grinding fighting at Kursk, with tanks stalled, fuel running dry, panzers burning under unrelenting Soviet fire, Hitler was forced to shift his gaze from the Eastern Front. Until then, Operation Citadel had been the crescendo of his war plans. Now, it was drawing its dying breath. The orders came down. Resources would be redirected. New weapons withheld. Panzer divisions halted. Citadel, once his last great gamble, was officially canceled. To the men on both sides of Kursk, the announcement felt surreal. In field HQs tens of miles apart, soldiers waited. They'd been told to push forward, that victory was close. Then, abruptly, everything stopped. No more fuel convoys. No more resupply. Nothing but silence and the faint crack of distant gunfire. With that one phrase from Italy, the German offensive collapsed, not with crashing tanks, but by bureaucratic command. High above the battered fields, airmen learned they would return west. Fuel, planes, entire Führer battalions were being rerouted to the Mediterranean. German tactical leaders watched their storm fade, as Sicily became the priority. They whispered in command posts, "He is turned away. Citadel dies." And they believed it. This was more than just a redeployment. It was a confession. Hitler had played high stakes, and lost. His armored spear, designed to cleave through the east, had faltered under mud, mines, attrition. Now resources were vanishing before their eyes, draining the offensive of its meaning. Men had fought and died for a plan no longer supported by its leader. In Moscow, word of Hitler's reversal electrified commanders. Stalin said little, but Zhukov emerged from the bunker with a single nod. Vasilevsky ordered Soviet reserves closer to the failing German front. The counterattack plans were already in motion. Citadel had begun to collapse, and the Soviets could sense the shift, even before the formal orders touched their lines. On July 18th, fresh Soviet tank corps surged forward in Operation Rumyantsev and Kutuzov. Tank crews rode T-34s into empty flank gaps. Rifle soldiers advanced through fields German infantry would withdraw from. The landscape changed tone, from defense to assault. Where hours before, German officers worried about holes in supply lines, now they watched their formations thin and split. Within the 9th and 4th Panzer Armies, commanders faced sobering reality. Their fuel stockpile, a single day's ration, was dwindling. Their transports had been diverted to Sicily. No more shells. No more armor reinforcements. And the Soviet armies pressed forward with a resolve born of opportunity. Vehicles on the German side burned. Batteries died. Engineers scrambled to blow bridges behind them, creating rubble when retreat became necessary. The Mendax bunker in Kursk heard these secret threads: withdrawal order pending. Attack canceled. In the dark, the meaning settled like ice. Their leader had wavered. Soviet prisoners found with maps and wristwatch stopwatches reported. German people are leaving positions with confusion, radio silence reigns. Some German wounded whispered they'd been ordered out the night before. Others claimed supply wagons were commandeered by Italian divisions shipping west. The shift was sudden and final. The atmosphere turned brittle. For German infantry, morale collapsed. A corporal wrote by candlelight, "We are the spear with no point." A tanker, silent, shaking, said, "We fought blind." Field medics counted survivors, noting deaths by exhaustion, not bullets. Drivers stared at empty drips of fuel in tanks, at engines cold and silent, at movements meaningless. Meanwhile, Soviet forces felt the turning tide. Soldiers in the trenches near Prokhorovka wrote creases into draft orders. Each day brought more supplies, more artillery, more tanks. Where German lines thinned face first, Soviet units pressed. They bent enemy formations. They cut off supply roads. They flooded through collapses. The war had shifted. Gradually, powerfully, irreversibly. Hitler's moment of hesitation had done more than reroute men. It surrendered the initiative. When he blinked, Kursk, or what was left, lost more than opportunity. It lost its fate. German radio operators broadcast coded frequencies of retreat orders. SS units began pulling back from forward fields. Rumors grew. In barracks, soldiers removed unit insignias. Some toasted their hometowns. Some wrote letters they expected would never be delivered. They spoke quietly of another war in West, of beaches they'd never see. The front they believed in had gone silent. In Moscow, command knew this was the moment. Soviet marshals ordered no hesitation. On July 19th, the final counterassault began. Rows of red banners lifted as new battalions marched. Rifle divisions surged over destroyed German pillboxes. T-34s crushed the broken veneer of defensive barriers. Sweat turned to grime, to determination, to advance. By July 21st, German positions once thought vital were abandoned. Fortifications fell without fight. Local commanders left diaries of confusion. Orders changed overnight. Our supply train disappeared. No support coming. In their own words, they felt betrayed by distant decisions they could not influence. Soviet momentum became unstoppable. The ground they had defended, they now took. Trenches became new front lines for attackers, not defenders. Where Germans once dug in, now the Red Army laid axles of armor. They cut rail lines, destroyed convoys, seized crossroads. Model and Manstein, both now defensive, met in command posts to coordinate delay tactics. They knew the offensive had died and a retreat had begun, but the retreat was over heavy ground and under pressure. Hitler's decision echoed across Europe. Sicily held priority, Kursk faded. An emperor had chosen to pivot, not from victory, but from exhaustion. The timing revealed what Kursk had revealed. Germany could no longer fight on too many fronts. Its armies had peaked and fractured. The defeat was not explosive. It was slow, deliberate, bureaucratic. At night, Soviet patrols burned captured German supplies. Survivors wandered fields with questions no one could answer. Corpses from both sides lay waiting. But Kursk's turning point had passed. For the first time since Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht recoiled. When the dust settled, it revealed Kursk as not just a decisive battle, but the beginning of Germany's end. The hammer had fallen, but the anvil had held, and the Eastern Front would never be the same. Chapter 18, Operation Kutuzov, The North Strikes Back. A thunderous roar shattered the pre-dawn air along the Ural front. Trenches crumpled like paper under Soviet artillery. German infantry braced as earth and steel collided. On July 12, 1943, Operation Kutuzov began, and the German position in the north collapsed with sudden ferocity. General Model's Ninth Army, already stretched thin from months of fighting around Kursk, now found itself beset from the flank. Massive Soviet armies of the Bryansk and Western fronts surged in behind German lines. Reserve infantry, fresh tank corps, and relentless artillery overswept defenses built of mud and memories. By midday, German infantry regiments were engulfed. By evening, entire sectors had been overrun. Model, known for his defensive acumen, now scrambled to patch breaches across two panzer armies. Reinforcements came in trickles. Soviet tank formations, rockets blazing, engines thundering, pressed the attack. The German line, once rigid and refusing to yield, buckled. Armored vehicles attempted to plug holes. Tanks moved into streets to block roads. But each addition only slowed the inevitable tide. Soviet air power grounded German resupply lines. Stuka dive bombers were scarce. Fuel convoys stuck in mud. Engineers could not fix broken tracks fast enough. Partisans sabotaged rail lines, blew bridges, and ambushed supply wagons in forested corridors. German garrisons listened to static on empty radios. Supplies vanished like ghosts before dawn. On July 15th, Operation Kutuzov entered its most brutal phase. New Soviet tank armies flanked German forward positions, driving toward Ural from the north and east. Civilians fled burning villages as German troops fell back through fields churned with red clay and broken steel. Tanks ground against mud and mines. Infantry pulled back through crumbled trenches. The pace of retreat accelerated beyond orders. Model finally called his shrinking Ninth Army to withdraw to its initial lines. But the ground had already changed. Defensive belts lay destroyed, minefields exposed, trenches collapsed. Soviet troops pressed every inch. German engineers welded rails and burned villages behind them to slow the pursuit. But morale eroded with each step back. Soldiers whispered, "We are no longer advancing. We are retreating." On August 5th, Soviet forces reached Ural itself. The city, once a German stronghold, fell after days of siege and encirclement. Red flags rose over broken buildings. German survivors packed into shell-shocked columns, marching east through smoke and silence. Many carried burned photos, torn letters, souvenirs of war turning against them. Model and Manstein met in hushed command posts. Words cracked. "The Panzer spear has been broken. We are hunters no more." Behind them, army groups reordered themselves for defense. And deep in Berlin, Hitler began to see what Kursk had revealed. His armies could no longer seize the initiative. In the aftermath, Soviet commanders turned eyes to the south. Another strike, Operation Rumyantsev, was already being readied. While the Wehrmacht bled in retreat, the Red Army surged onward, logistics humming, morale high, territory regained. Operation Kutuzov had shattered the northern Ural salient. German forces were no longer the hunters, but the hunted. The tide had turned decisively, and the north had struck back. Chapter 19, Operation Polkovodets Rumyantsev, Southern Collapse. The city burned before dawn. Flames danced across shattered streets. Smoke twisted above hollowed buildings. Men ran through alleys choked with debris. That was Belgorod. It was July 1943, and everything Germany had held in the south was about to be swept away. Only days after Soviet forces shattered the German northern flank with Operation Kutuzov, their southern counterpart, Operation Polkovodets Rumyantsev, launched from the city of Belgorod. This was not a probe. It was a hammer blow. Fresh tank armies, battle-hardened infantry divisions, and artillery regiments moved forward in cold, precise formation. Their target, Kharkiv, once the industrial jewel of Ukraine, now a symbol of Soviet resilience. German commanders were stunned. They had believed the southern pincer, led by Manstein's battered 4th Panzer Army, could hold onto Belgorod. But with Citadel aborted and supplies diverted, their strength had dwindled. Some units had barely enough fuel for one more counterattack. Others had no shells left. German frontline officers later wrote of men who still hoped. But behind them, retreat lines lay vulnerable. The Soviet artillery hammered forward belts with overwhelming force. Massive Katyusha rocket launchers, nicknamed Stalin's organ, screamed across valleys, thread-like projectiles trailing wake. Within the first hours of the assault, German forward trenches lay in ruin. Bridges were destroyed. Roads became impassable. Panzer grenadiers advanced through fields of shrapnel and flame. Civilians fled in terror. Everything changed. Belgorod fell after fierce house-to-house fighting. though by day 2 most of the German forces had already withdrawn under cover of night. Soviet tanks, led by the 5th Guards and 1st Tank Armies, surged forward. They pushed through German lines, cutting off retreating columns. Those able to escape collapsed onto railroads, their tanks silent, engines cold. On July 16th, the operation moved into its second phase. Tank formations circled behind German positions, severing supply lines from the rear. The panzer units were trapped. People wrote in diaries, "We are cut off. We cannot resupply." Fuel trucks sat abandoned. Ammunition depots lay melted. Engineers set new anti-tank obstacles, but the lines were already broken behind them. Kharkiv stood as the ultimate goal. Once the site of Soviet defeats, it was now the prize. On July 23rd, tank columns circled the city from 3 directions. German defenders were surprised. Some units surrendered en masse. Civilian workers lowered drawbridges and hoisted red flags. In under 24 hours, the old northern gateways had flipped to Soviet control. It was the 4th fall of Kharkiv in the war, but this time the Germans could not reclaim it. German commanders in disarray raced to set up new lines, but reserves were thin and morale lower. Men fell back through towns set alight. Radios crackled with calls for reinforcements, only to meet silence. Field hospitals overflowed with burnt, broken men blaming leadership as much as battle. For Soviet infantry, this southern strike was sweet justice. Many had fought in past defeats, Stalingrad, Orel, Kharkov. Now their units moved together. Riflemen wrote letters home in dugouts. "Kharkov is ours today." Tank crews yelled slogans across hulls. For Kursk, for Orel, for motherland. German losses were staggering. Panzer divisions reported 50 tanks destroyed or disabled per day during the assault. Infantry units had lost half their fighting strength in casualties and desertion. Even high command admitted internal collapse. Manstein, once confident, sent a single message: "We must retreat to Dnieper lines." German supply mesh crumbled under Soviet artillery. By July 25th, Soviet forces reached the outskirts of Kharkov. Eastern Elephant tank destroyers trundled through mine-choked fields. Red flags waved above streets. Kharkov burned again, but this time as a beacon of German withdrawal. In these days, the Soviet juggernaut gained credibility. They moved with speed and coordination. Logistics had improved beyond recognition. Supply lines worked. Every captured road offered fresh fuel and ammunition. Field kitchens cooked hot meals again. Soldiers laughed, cried, all at once. They knew momentum was theirs. Meanwhile, German units fractured. Moral collapse set in. A German colonel later wrote, "We expected a bloody fight. Instead, we received blank orders and chaos." Another tank driver confessed, "I drove my last tank across Belgorod border. Now I walk home." Hitler was informed. The field marshal's report confirmed Citadel had failed. Bulgarian fronts were collapsing. Highway to the Dnieper was becoming the German fallback. Hitler cursed in his bunker, not at Soviet force, but at his own miscalculation. From Orel to Kharkov, the Eastern Front had shifted from German advance to Soviet offensive. Offensive after defensive. Soviet minds were not triumphant. They were resolute. Ahead lay logistics for pushing into Ukraine. They spoke of positions beyond Kharkov, roads to Dnipropetrovsk, Donbass. Germany's Axis conquests were reversing. One officer scratched the words in his map. Soviet momentum is unstoppable. And yet, the war was not over. Germany still controlled swaths of land further west. New positions could be built. But for the first time since Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht was in retreat. Operation Rumyantsev had shattered the southern front. Germany's southern collapse was no longer gradual, it was total. The furthest Nazi advance in the east had ended, and the tide of war had turned decisively. Chapter 20. The Fall of Kharkov, again. The city gates collapsed before dawn. Flames licked the sky. Kharkov lay torn. Once more a crucible of war, now a symbol of German collapse. For the fourth time in the war, Kharkov changed hands. By late July 1943, Soviet forces had encircled the city using swift tank thrusts and rifle divisions advancing from three sides. German defenders fled east, leaving anti-tank guns jammed in street corners and burnt-out half-tracks abandoned in alleys slick with grease and blood. Belgorod had already fallen, and now Kharkov lay in ruins. Soviet soldiers entered on July 23, pushing through shattered doorways and wrecked factories. Civilians watched from crumbling balconies. Some offered bread and tea, others wept openly. Kremlin banners unfurled on square posts. Soldiers patted them with trembling hands. This time, it will stick. German units, already stretched thin by supply shortages and attrition, found themselves surrounded. Communication broke. Radio calls for evac failed. Officers scribbled withdrawal orders by candlelight. One column surrendered en masse at dawn, too weary to fight. Another stole away at midnight, wheels grinding over burned-out streets, hoping to slip through gaps in Soviet lines. Many didn't. Many were captured at the city's outskirts, soaking in July rain that felt like sorrow. The fall of Kharkov revealed Germany's unraveling in the east. Where once they had stormed through, now they were exhausted. Where once they held industrial power, now they held ruin. Kharkov, as the fourth city to fall and rise in German sway, had become a harbinger. The tide was not just slowing, it was reversing. For the Red Army, Kharkov was redemption. Soldiers who had fled in earlier campaigns now returned. They cleaned monuments battered by war. They cleared streets blocked with rubble. They stood guard at train stations once used to deport neighbors. They lit fires in wrecked homes. And they whispered, "We return for good." In German command posts, defeat was admitted in hushed tones. Manstein spoke of regrouping on the Dnieper River. Model prepared fallback positions at Poltava. Supplies for Kursk were gone. He wrote, "The spear is broken, but the shield remains. But even shields rust under bombardment." Belgorod was lost. Kharkov was fallen. German reserves were now a shadow. For Hitler, Kharkov was a final confirmation. The Eastern Front could no longer be won. For the Soviets, it was a turning point toward liberation. The German war machine had faltered. Its men now marched east, not west. The next act would take them across rivers, but not forward. Kharkov had fallen. German hopes in the east began to unravel. Chapter 21, Counting the Dead, Burying the Tanks. Bodies lay silent in broken hulls. A T-34 half buried in mud dripped oil-colored rain from its gun barrel. A German soldier's helmet rested atop a Soviet corpse. Ravaged fields held their breath. That was Kursk after war. Beauty lost beneath fire, metal, and grief. The final days after the fighting stopped revealed the scale. Over 100,000 men lay dead. Fields once marched by armored giants were littered with steel broken as brittle bones. Some historians estimate tank losses on both sides exceeded 6,000. Wrecked Panthers, Tigers, Ferdinands, and T-34s strewn like giant carcasses across the steppe. Ammunition dumps exploded in the distance. Artillery craters cratered into the horizon. Now, ghosts walked among the ruins. Medics, engineers, survivors, searching, counting, burying. For Soviet soldiers, the victory had a weight. They had turned the tide, but at what cost? Comrades they once laughed with lay buried under stones or shrouded by shrapnel. Some units, like the 5th Guards Tank Army, returned to bases, found empty tanks whose crews were gone. Engineers stacked medals with empty sleeves. Mothers and wives in distant villages folded fresh cloth into small coffins, hoping for names. German survivors fared no better. Tank crews deserted rusted Panthers when ammo was gone. Infantry lay dead in trenches they had dug themselves. Letters home, scribbled in blood-spatter handwriting, were found in pockets, unopened. Survivors wrote in diaries, "We fought till nothing left." Commanders judged awards by the silence of heroic deeds. The Wehrmacht reeled under casualty rates that devastated morale. Replacement soldiers were pulled from training. They wore shoes too big, uniforms too stiff, into the jaws of a war they barely understood. At night, the field hospitals overflowed. Doctors performed amputations by lantern light. Wounded cried out about lost limbs, lost friends, lost tomorrow. The smell of infection clung to the tents. Nurses wrote letters to families. He fought bravely. He died with honor. Meanwhile, trucks rolled in shallow graves, dumping bodies wrapped in coarse linen. Dogs scurried among graves. The living counted the cost. But so too did maps. Soviet generals amended reports. Destroyed German tanks. 5,825. German intelligence filed damage claims. Soviet losses. Approximate 4,220 tanks. Yet the real losses lay in memories. The names of fallen etched in bowed heads. For both sides, Kursk's aftermath meant rebuilding or surrender. Soviet engineers dragged tracks out of mud, salvaged copper, rebuilt destroyed bridges. Factories churned out T-34s faster than German depots could repair Panthers. The battlefield became a grave and a workshop. Propaganda films celebrated heroic stands. Survivors spoke of Kursk as turning point. Still, they asked quietly, is everything worth it? In Berlin, rumors circulated. The German armored divisions were no longer capable of offensive war. Only hasty defenses remained. Officers whispered about how Citadel had bled them dry. They counted men lost as if accounting deaths. Some later wrote, Kursk broke the Wehrmacht, not with one strike, but with slow erosion. Harvesters in modern fields still uncover bullets, helmets, remains. Memorial events honor tens of thousands who died. Tank museums display wrecks raised from the soil. But no exhibit can show the hollow in a soldier's chest when he learned his friend was gone. History writes numbers. Memory buries names. Kursk's field, once silent, now echoes in memory halls and history books. A turning point, yes, but also a graveyard. And as survivors aged, their eyes no longer glowed with victory, but with haunted remembrance. The battle ended. The tanks rusted. Survival began, not at Kursk's spark, but in its aftermath. And yet, even as the tank fires cooled, the war beyond Kursk was just beginning. Chapter 22, Morale and Propaganda. A battlefield stained by blood. Smoke choked the horizon. Survivors waved tattered flags, some crying, others silent. That was Kursk after the clash, the raw memory of victory and loss. But on both sides, stories would be told to make sense of it all. In Berlin, Nazi propaganda began to spin Kursk as a strategic pause, not a defeat. State newspapers ran images of smiling Panther crews inspecting captured Soviet T-34s. Official communiques spoke of glorious resistance and temporary tactical adjustments. Losses were downplayed, shifted into enemy exaggeration, and buried beneath talk of future blitzes. Soldiers on leave were scripted to say, "We held them back." Families heard speeches about heroic sacrifice, not logistical failure. Yet German troops in Kursk held notes beneath collars and in secret diaries. Fuel lines cut, tanks stranded, no air support, morale slipping, not from enemy guns, but from exhaustion. Officers whispered in hushed tones. We were promised victory, but left with silence. They carried letters home they never expected to send. Within their ranks, faith in the narrative faltered. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Soviet media roared. It called Kursk a decisive turning point, a red wave rolling westward. Headlines screamed, enemy crushed at Kursk, tank armies broken. Propaganda posters showed triumphant Red Army soldiers planting the flag atop armored wreckage. Radio broadcasts recited casualty figures, 4,000 German tanks destroyed, dozens of panzers captured. Victory was absolute. Soviet propaganda amplified individual stories. They honored private heroes. The tank commander who held Prokhorovka alone until backup arrived. The infantry squad who mined a bridge to halt German armor. The dispatcher who rerouted supply trains away from danger. Award ceremonies were staged at field hospitals. Wounded soldiers received medals as nursing sisters pinned them across broken chests. For courage at Kursk, morale rose swiftly behind those stories. Letters from front lines carried slogans. We are forging victory. Citizens wrote songs and poems celebrating Kursk. Even children learned its name by heart. Yet behind closed doors, some soldiers admitted quietly, "We survived. That is victory enough." But propaganda had limits. Km-long ruins didn't film well. Thousands of dead couldn't be edited out. Grainy footage showed tank hulks burning in the distance. Soviet newspapers published photos of wreckage, but always with victorious banners fluttering over the ruins. German photos were censored or relabeled as staged scenes. "We won't show the burnouts." Some German mothers wrote letters demanding proof of their son's survival. They never received answers. Within the Red Army, not everyone believed the victory was clean. Some officers argued their counteroffensives, Kutuzov, Rumyantsev, weren't complete successes. Civilian casualties in recaptured cities were high. Prisoners were beaten or neglected. But these stories stayed suppressed. The official narrative held firm. Kursk was moral redemption for every past defeat. For German officers, the propaganda was toxic. They witnessed failure. They witnessed retreat. Yet on return trains to the Reich, they were told to recite victory at Kursk. The disconnect sowed anger. Some returned to civilian life in silence. Others turned to defeatist whispers. "Our leaders lie. We fight tomorrow or die." In Soviet field hospitals, morale and propaganda converged. Surviving infantry and tank crews were paraded before journalists. Smartly dressed, they held freshly issued medals. Some cried. Some smiled. Most were exhausted but felt a weight lifted. They had survived. They had held. They had advanced. Meanwhile, German propaganda films included staged interviews with captured Soviet officers who claimed Kursk was a stalemate or even a German success. These were used to mislead domestic audiences. Soldiers at the front laughed. Many of them captured had themselves been starved, wounded, and surrendered only when surrounded. They called the films propaganda dreams. The atmosphere on both sides transformed. In the East, the Soviets believed in destiny. In Germany, some began to believe in denial. But the battlefield, the real one, did not lie. As Soviet armies rolled west, retaking Orel, Belgorod, Kharkov, the films and headlines became true. The soldiers on the ground, exhausted, hungry, hopeful, knew the real story. Not the propaganda, but the advance. And as German civilians watched the victories vanish newsreels, many asked quietly, what did they lose? Propaganda sold a version of Kursk. Morale responded with truth. And in the ruins of both, reality awaited. Chapter 23. The Death of Blitzkrieg. The roar of a Panther's engine died mid-thunder as it sat stalled in a cratered field, treads sliced by hidden mines. Its commander climbed out, face grim, eyes searching the ruined horizon. That moment, tank silent, man exposed, caught the death of a doctrine, Blitzkrieg. At Kursk in July 1943, Germany's lightning war collided with Soviet steel and terrain and failed. No longer could German panzer columns thunder across open land. The tank spear had lost its point. For 4 brutal years, Germany had conquered with speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. Fast-moving armor, supported by air power, shattered defenses across Europe. But at Kursk, that machine ran out of momentum. The German war plan, built around swift, decisive strikes, ground to a halt under weight of mines, mud, attrition. They attacked with nearly 1 million men, thousands of tanks and aircraft, but Soviet layers of defense stopped them. When Hitler finally canceled Operation Citadel, it was not a strategic retreat. It was the end of large-scale German offensives in the East. From that point on, German forces did not advance, they withdrew. The initiative had shifted. With Citadel buried in mud and wreckage, German aims turned defensive. Army Group Center moved behind the Dnieper. 9th and 4th Panzer armies dug in and held trenches rather than push forward. Panzer strength diminished each day. Supply lines crumbled. Morale drained. The German narrative changed from victory to survival. The months following Kursk revealed the extent of the collapse. Soviet forces rolled westward. Belgorod, Orel, and Kharkov fell in rapid succession. The Wehrmacht tore down villages to slow them, burned fields to deny them, but could not stop them. Operation Kutuzov and Rumyantsev broke German lines, recaptured territory lost years before. Where once German banners flew, now Soviet flags flickered in the fields. The hunter became hunted. For individual soldiers, the shift was visceral. A German tank commander scribbled in his log, "This feels like the end." A Soviet infantryman etched on a trench wall, "Our time dawns." German veterans recalled the crushing truth. Blitzkrieg was gone, not from defeat in combat, but from collapse of supply, loss of momentum, and exhaustion of resources. Soviet soldiers remembered not only the roar of tanks, but the whispered hope of advance, that each dawn delivered their armored columns closer to Berlin. High command quietly changed language. Gone was talk of Blitzkrieg. Instead, they spoke of withdrawal, defensive lines, hold at all costs. Hitler's speeches ceased referencing Kursk as turning point. Instead, he shored up fronts along the rivers and ordered fortresses erected along the line. German newspapers downplayed the Eastern Front. Everywhere, victory faded into endurance. Meanwhile, Soviet doctrine flourished. Their combined arms strategy, infantry, artillery, tanks, air, had defeated the German edge. Logistics worked. Factories rebuilt. Every wreck they raised taught them lessons. Momentum became their weapon. They moved not in shock and awe, but in steady, sustained push. Supply trucks moved through daylight, not diesel glowing through darkness. They delivered shells, food, fuel, and with each load, renewed the offensive. Blitzkrieg, once mythic, had died not in a great collapse, but in quiet failure. Kursk did not explode German hope in one big moment. It bled them slowly. It forced Hitler to look away. It cost the Wehrmacht its offensive will. And once Germany no longer attacked, once Soviet forces advanced without fear, there was no going back. The Eastern Front would never be the same. The balance had shifted. From now on, every German move would be retrenching, defending, delaying. Every Soviet movement forward would be reclamation, push, liberation. The war that began with German might was now being ended one Soviet advance at a time. And the moment the last tank fell silent at Kursk, that was the moment Blitzkrieg truly died. Chapter 24, Lessons from Kursk, New Warfare Realized. The earth shook as tank tracks ground the soil beneath. Metal beasts pitched into minefields, their hulks smoking in silent defeat. A single panther lay turned on its side. Its commander sat atop its turret, staring into ruined sky. This was Kursk's harshest lesson. War had changed. Guerrilla bursts of brilliance could no longer win battles. Instead, endurance, coordination, and adaptation would rule. At Kursk, Germany's belief in fast, isolated armor thrusts, Blitzkrieg in its pure form, was shattered. Tanks could no longer race ahead expecting infantry, artillery, and air support to catch up. Soviet defenses had forced German armor to slow, exposing them to counterattacks. The new reality, combined arms warfare. That meant tanks moving with infantry alongside artillery and close air support as a single, interlocked force. One missing spoke, and the will stalled. Corporate commanders learned that layered defense, mines, trenches, wire, ditch, neutralizes shock tactics. Engineers built defensive belts so deep that an armored break had to fight through 5 or 6 lines, each killing morale and destroying resources. Wrecked German vehicles counted as lessons. Engines overheated, fire broke out, crews suffocated. The battlefield became a laboratory of failures. Air power redefined dominance. The Soviet Il-2 flying tanks, armored aircraft built to dive into tanks at low altitude, protected ground forces better than ever before. Luftwaffe losses showed that air superiority must be constant and integrated. At Kursk, Soviet fighters escorted bombers and ground aircraft 24-hour cycles. They targeted supply lines, railroads, fuel depots. German forces lacked consistent coverage. Aircraft were diverted west, parts were limited. That cost them kills and lives alike. Communication became critical. Soviet radio operators linked infantry, artillery, and pilots into coordinated strikes. German advance faltered when their radios lost signal, supply lines broke, and headquarters lost track of front lines. At Kursk, many German units attacked blind, trusting maps that no longer matched the battlefield. The Soviets had trained operators like Lena, a young radio woman who rerouted units and called in artillery strikes within minutes. Those seconds saved thousands of lives. Yet what became most striking was adaptation. Soviet engineers studied German flaws. They reinforced suspensions, improved camouflage, shifted formations at night, trained anti-tank crews to aim for tracks, not turrets. They held mock drills and recreated German minefields near Kursk after the battle. Lessons were learned fast. Germany, by contrast, had delayed Panther deployment, couldn't fix transmission failures, and lost numbers faster than replacements could arrive. Kursk changed rights of command. Hitler's generals, Manstein, Model, learned bluntly, strategy without logistics was suicide. Soviet marshals, Zhukov, Vasilevsky, learned their best formations were useless without supply convoys, field kitchens, medical trains, ammunition pipelines. Kursk exposed this simple truth. War is as much about trailers as it is about tanks. For soldiers, this transformation became personal. Infantry in Soviet ranks were trained not only to shoot, but to coordinate with tanks and planes, calling targets and adjusting fire in real time. German soldiers felt stranded when their panzers broke down and no infantry came. T-34 crews learned to fight fast, then fade into forest before German counterattack. German SS troops found their speed turned against them by terrain they didn't know, forest flanks, hidden mines, sniper fire. By winter 1943, the Red Army had reorganized every level of command. Tank armies were divided into corps that coordinated with rifle divisions and anti-tank artillery. Engineers built roads in contested fields. Airfields were mobile. Fuel trucks moved at night. Communications units rode in half-tracks behind frontline troops. Kursk-born doctrine shaped all Soviet actions westward toward Berlin. Meanwhile, Germany abandoned large offensives. The Eastern Front became a series of defensive rings, each designed to delay Soviet advances. Entire panzer divisions were held in reserve as static fire brigades. The Wehrmacht relied on landmines, scorched earth tactics, and defensive depth. The weapons remained strong, but the doctrine had changed. Kursk also altered post-war strategy. NATO studied it. Generals in later wars built layered defense models and cell-based command structures. They saw that mass armor without flexibility was doomed, and that air-ground armor coordination became standard doctrine. Employees of modern armies learned from soldiers like Kutuzov or SS commanders who dared push too far. After Kursk, the formula became clear: speed plus protection, offense plus retreat strategy, aggression plus anticipation. Kursk taught that war was not symphony. It was a living organism adapting at every beat. But it wasn't perfect. Soviet casualties at Kursk numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Civilians were caught in shifting front lines. Factories were leveled. Prisoners suffered. Even in victory, Kursk's cost was enormous. And German survivors carried scars, not just physical, but mental, of strategies built on hubris rather than humility. The final lesson reseated all command postures. Do not seek war to revolutionize the world. Build defense to endure. Use offense to create opportunity. And adapt or die. Kursk rewrote the rulebook, not with grand speeches or memorial statues, but in mud, metal, blood, and courage. And those who studied it next war found peace in its lessons. That was Kursk's lasting gift. Chapter 25, Voices from the Front. A shell burst so close the ground heaved beneath him. Blood ran down his side, mixing with mud and grit. Private Ivan Petrov, barely 19, whispered into his radio, "They're everywhere. I can't hold much longer." That message, snapped into the static, carried the raw terror and determination of Kursk. It was the voice of survival. From the trenches at Panayrai Station came the written diary of Lieutenant Nikolai Sokolov. July 7th. 3 tanks burned today. Our mortar crew cut in half. Yet we hold the trench. I pray tonight. His words crackled with equal parts fear and stubborn resolve. He vowed to fight for his mother's name on the fields once considered firm German ground. On the German side, SS Sturmbannführer Heinrich Franz sent this hurried message: Panther in ditch, crew wounded. No support. Orders from HQ unclear. Still moving west at dawn. The clipped tone masked terror and confusion. He had trained for war. He had hoped for victory. Instead, he'd found chaos. Then there was Maria Volkova, a Soviet telephone operator buried in a bunker near Prokhorovka. Her diary entry read, "My fingers hurt from signaling. We sit beneath shellfire. Radio lines dead. 2 men died before lunch. Yet we reroute orders to the artillery. Every shell now counts. We are the pulse behind the guns." Her voice reveals the lifeline that keeps an army alive. In the shadow of a burned-out Panther, Private Kurt Weiss, a German panzer grenadier, carved in the vehicle's hull. I was 19. I saw 2 friends die on July 8th. The tank commanded 24 shells today. We fired. We fell back. I keep this helmet. For family. His grief, etched into steel, reveals the human cost behind strategy. A radio operator, Sergeant Elena Mikhailova, intercepted German messages throughout July. Panzergruppe auf Positions zwei. She translated. The enemy panzer group had shifted. With that line confirmed, artillery batteries were shifted and saved hundreds of Soviet lives. She spoke to no one of that role when medals arrived. Instead, she wrote, "My work is in silence, but I know what we stopped." Surgeon Captain Igor Petrenko treated broken men in the Bones Hospital of Belgorod. His log read, Day 7, wounds too many to count. Face burned under engine blast. We lost half a company today. The cursed irony. We saved survivors we could walk past tomorrow. His entries echo trauma, tears, duty. A German tank driver, Oberstfreiter Mahler, scribbled these final lines in his last letter home. Marching east tomorrow. Enemy always behind. Spare fuel runs out today. I don't know what's left. Only forward is loss. He signed it Der Letzte, the last one. Soldier voices converged one evening in a makeshift clinic near Kharkiv. For men, 2 Soviet, 2 German, lay side by side. One German insisted on reading from a Soviet diary. They call us enemies across the trench. We bleed in the same mud. The Soviet soldier nodded with tears. They shared water sachets soaked in dust, the enemy and the ally both human. Their stories aren't statistics. They're breathing proof that Kursk was not just a clash of tanks, but a collection of breaking men and women. Their faces, etched into letters and soot, were the true battlefield. Their memories will echo beyond memorial stones. And across the distance between trenches, past lines of minefields and barbed wire. They are the voices that survived. Chapter 26. Kursk today, the silent fields. A lone tank turret lies half buried in the soil, rusted and overgrown. Nearby, wildflowers sway where trenches once fired. No bells sound. No engines roar, just wind above silent fields. That is Kursk today, a battlefield turned to quiet. Reminders of terror smoothed by time. Yet beneath the calm earth lies memory. Drive along the roads west of Kursk city, and you'll come upon memorial hills, mounds of earth marking graves. Crossed by the Russian flag, each is called a kurgan, a mound erected over tens of thousands of soldiers. Visitors lay flowers and candles. They trace names on granite stones. Men conscripted from Moscow, Stalingrad, Orel, girls killed in mortar bursts, tank crew trapped in flaming hulls. Many stones bear no names, just unknown, silent witnesses to missing souls. A modern museum near Prokhorovka displays charred track links and shell fragments urchining the entrance. Inside, a battered court display recounts the names of 316 German tanks destroyed within 50 meters of the stand. A Soviet T-34 turret stands on a pedestal, its hatch open in remembrance. For many visitors, the room echoes with hushed sobs. Guides, often vets or children of veterans, speak quietly. He fired 60 shells from that tank, someone whispers. He died there. In the fields where panther remains littered the mud, wild grasses hide twisted steel. On forest borders, a line of white crosses traces the edge of the battlefield. There's no barrier to remind you of war, only these symbols and silence. No rushing crowds, only the occasional jogger, the occasional lone pilgrim in a black coat placing daisy chains. Local teachers bring students to the mound of armored wrecks. They point at rusty treads jutting from the ground. They ask students to listen, without words. Silence is memory. One teacher told me, they must feel the silence before they grasp the sound of war. Folklore has grown too. Farmers speak of turning soil to find shell casings or dog tags. Some turn them into necklaces, saying they carry history in their pockets. Others bring them to war archives to see if they match lists of missing. Even kids know not to remove objects. They leave everything intact out of respect. The soil holds memory, and certain farmers treat it as holy. At the Prokhorovka Memorial Complex, every evening a single trumpet plays at sunset, a melody called the Field of Tanks. Locals gather around a central flame. Older men and women stand with wreaths, war medals pinned like old wounds. They share stories. My father marched this field after the battle, counting exhaust pipes. My grandmother hid here under fire. She still remembers the roar. Historic reenactments occur each summer. Civilians wear faded uniforms, fire replica artillery, roll old tank silhouettes across fields. But after the flash and noise, silence. Observers partake in memorial services. Some kneel in mud where Germans once sunk. Children lean to pick poppies near shell holes, then bow heads. The day blurs into remembrance. A young veteran, now a schoolteacher, carries his father's diary in a leather pouch. He reads its pages aloud at ceremonial events near Kharkov's outskirts. He speaks of frozen nights, hunger, and fear, and of surviving. He never crossed this ground, the sun says, tears glistening. But his spirit did. Not all traces are physical. Memory lives in stories passed down. One grandmother in Kursk city recounts hiding for days in a cellar as shells rattled roof tiles. She tells her grandchildren that the house still bears scars on its beams. They touch them, feel them, even when the world outside is warm and safe. Tourists come, as international visitors, veterans from Germany and Poland, curious young people. They walk the memorial alleys, gaze at plaques listing 2 million casualties across Kursk operation. Some weep openly. Some stand in awe. They sign visitor books. Never forget. Peace is fragile. The battlefield had disappeared, but not its absence. In many places, nature has healed the scars. Trees root through tank carcasses, grasses reclaim craters. Only when the wind whispers on those fields does the past appear to murmur back. Modern militaries study Kursk too. Russia's general staff hosts seminars near old frontline routes. Officers trek through trenches and rusted vehicles. They discuss armored warfare, mine belt defense, air-ground coordination. They debate how Kursk's lessons still apply. One officer said, "Even now, we dig in, and we remember we're not to repeat." Between memorial fire and museum quiet, the fields speak. Silence can hold memory. Memory can teach strategy. Strategy can save lives. Kursk today is not just a site of death. It is a classroom, a tomb, a threshold between past and future. But as dusk fades behind horizon, one truth lingers. The land once stormed with war machines is now quiet. Yet its echoes are louder than ever. Chapter 27. The Iron Tempest ends. Kursk in world history. A massive field of fire. Over 12,000 artillery shells landing per minute. A Panther's engine exploded in a hail of ivory flame. In that inferno of metal and mud, the fate of an empire hung in balance and began to flip. Kursk was more than a battle. It was the moment the Iron Tempest began to crumble. Germany's armored might had advanced once across Europe like a hurricane, sweeping cities, fencing borders, toppling regimes. At Kursk, that storm met something unbreakable. Terrain, tactics, time, and a people determined to hold. Before sunrise on July 5, 1943, Operation Citadel roared to life. German tanks and cannons struck Soviet lines in massive coordination. But the Soviet defense had learned. Mines blew treads. Trenches slowed columns. Airstrikes shredded supply lines. The unmatched concentration of Soviet fighters and artillery ground Germany's strategy into stalling chaos. They hit the Soviet defenses, but the defenses hit back harder. By July 12th, at Prokhorovka, Panzer crews froze in burning hulls. Tigers died in pits. Panthers slipped into ditches. Soviet T-34 crews charged through thick smoke to flank rear armor. No one emerged unscathed. That single day, recorded as the largest tank clash in history, didn't deliver victory to either side. But for Germany, it delivered a painful truth. The storm could stall. The Iron Tempest could falter. In the north, Model's Ninth Army pushed and paused. Losses mounted. Attrition became doctrine. Supplies vanished. Communications severed. And when Soviet Operation Kutuzov raged southward, the German defenses buckled. Redemption at Orel turned to retreat. In the south, Rumyantsev swept away Belgorod, reclaimed Kharkiv, shattered German defenses in days. Then came the moment Hitler blinked. Sicily's invasion diverted fuel, talent, priority. Citadel died. The grand strike ended not by bullets, but by a shift in focus and broken logistics. The Panzer Spear lost its nerve. From that point forward, Germany could only retreat or hold, not seize. The initiative passed to the Red Army. Prokhorovka, Orel, Kharkiv, Belgorod, all swept back into Soviet hands. Kursk wasn't just a loss. It was the turning tide. After Kursk, every German offensive on the Eastern Front would be small and defensive, and every Soviet counterstroke would push deeper. This redefined modern warfare. Kursk exposed the myth that armor alone could win. It demonstrated the power of combined arms, infantry coordinating with tanks, artillery, and air support. It taught that air superiority must be constant, not surrendered in crisis. Mine belts, layered trenches, camouflage tactics, engineer foresight became essential. The battlefield evolved. Tactics, vehicles, communications, every military doctrine transformed. For soldiers like Private Ivan, radio calls that rerouted artillery saved his wounded comrade. For Lieutenant Sokolov, his mortar crew held the village because infantry pressed forward. For the German Panzer Grenadier, the failure of fuel convoys revealed that war is as much about trucks as tanks. For Elena, the radio operator, intelligence turned into life-saving shots on German armored columns. Kursk was not only blown fields and clashing metal. It was these human stories layered into things bigger than strategy. Today, Kursk is a reference point. Generals study it. Military historians dissect it. Armored doctrine, defensive belts, air-ground coordination. Lessons from Kursk became templates for wars in Korea, Vietnam, Middle East, Ukraine. It proved no weapon works alone. For veterans who survived, not as heroes, but as witnesses, Kursk lives in their eyes. Rekindled only when they step on the fields once scorched by war. Some wars were fought to win ground. Kursk was fought to prove that ground alone was not victory, that endurance, adaptation, unity, and will matter more. Germany suffered staggering losses. Soviet heroic narrative rose, but Soviet losses were higher still. The fields of Kursk carried 500,000 dead, millions injured or scarred. Cities, villages, forests were drawn into the vortex. The human cost was grotesque, yet the war had shifted. What Germany stole in early summer of 1943, it could not reclaim. The Panzer Spear broke. The eastern tide turned red, and the war, once stalled, now surged inexorably westward. Kursk was not the war's end, but it was the moment the war changed. Nazi ambition collapsed. Soviet momentum crystallized. The future of Europe pivoted. As the plume from burning tanks faded behind the steppes horizon, what remained was not ruin, or just victory, but a lesson written in steel and sweat. Power lies not only in speed, but in coordination, not only in surprise, but in resilience, not only in offense, but in enduring until initiative shifts. Kursk was the moment when the Iron Tempest ended, and the symbol of Hitler's fate was sealed. And beyond the fields, beyond the wreckage, the world would never be the same.